Okay, yeah.
It's a complete rabbit warren, and so it's really like pull a thread. And so honestly, like, this is the kind of thing where I mean, I've run into a whole bunch of projects that I've never heard nothing about, and some of them are entire domains that I've heard nothing about. You know, it's like, oh, there's the whole constellation of projects over here.
About this, but yeah.
You know, and so really it kind of comes down to like, I mean, if you have a specific application that you can kind of filter things by, is anyone in this space, if you're trying to get a sense of like just what are the different high-level categories that people are looking at, then, you know, a mixture, you know, a decent amount of web sleuthing can get you that. There's like, okay, here's some broad categories. You know, there's people who've done a lot of that research for you. But like, I'm a member of one group that's on Facebook that's like, they basically do crypto day trading.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I follow 1% or less of what you're talking about. I have no fucking idea.
That's great. I love
You know, and I'm okay with it. I just kind of keep it in my periphery. It's
Yeah.
like, okay, I ask these guys questions when I have certain sorts of questions, and the rest of the time, it's like, okay, this is the thing that's happening.
Yeah. Well, everybody's not understanding.
Yeah.
How are you doing?
Very good. How are you? Good to see you, Jordan.
Hello,
Yes, yeah.
Use the laptop and
It's
Your
just that
favorite thing
it's
to
connected
do.
trying to do Windows PCs. I don't know if like
Yes.
if we need to like try to hard swap your machine for it.
well, there's it's just a slide area. It's on the office.
Okay, cool.
I'm sure I can
I was going to marry you right into the block.
Okay.
Well, that's all. I didn't know if you wanted to like live do.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Oh, no, the workshop, I'm hoping
Alright.
to rank people for technology.
Yeah, he's super friendly. He needs to be fed. All right,
Okay, so-
let's go.
Where's that come
So Harry's the one giving
I
that.
think it's like shoot.
Thanks for that.
Yeah, pleasure. That's the reason I'm here is really you just get such an awesome combination of people from you know all over the country, all over the world. You know, there's definitely a bias towards tech,
Yeah.
but it's not exclusive to it either. It gets you interesting.
Tiny.
Yeah, I want to find that other religion guy who is like, who had the religion question.
Yeah. You should also talk. I gave your name to Jess if you meet her because she was looking for some.
Tiny.cc/RC.
She was looking for some stuff in the Berkeley area for like retreats and stuff. Like, I have no idea, but you would probably know.
Well,
Yeah, let's see.
that's what
You put it in yet?
Yeah, it should be there if you refresh.
capital W, capital B.
So did you guys decide on when I'm taking over?
So then,
Which session should I plan on missing?
We can, like, you know, I can just sit here
Okay.
and have a presentation.
nice.
I think once he's fed, he'll be okay. He's very engaged.
How's your shoulder doing? I heard you have a hip injury.
Yeah, that's very bad.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah. Did you also pull up the schedule just to make sure that you have the
When you have time and are not giving
well, it's mirrored displays.
I sent you. Oh, I didn't.
Yeah, you send it back. I want to look at that.
Nice.
I have things that happen in my head that I don't know whether or not they happen in actuality. And sometimes I have conversations with people in my head that I think I've actually had.
Sometimes so for me, I'm really prone to doing that when I'm going to sleep. So, like, I do that deep, when I probably should.
as long as you don't wake up pissed at her about how she responded to you in your dream.
Oh no, it's usually more that like, oh yeah, it's totally cool. I'm doing
What I missed the conversation.
Oh, the conversations you have with people in your head, but you forget to actually like
Refactor.
have the conversation.
I could probably name this better. Does this need to be a PowerPoint X instead of a?
I mean, whatever you want. Could be Google Slides.
Let's see what
I think, yeah, PPTX probably works. I think this is Windows 10. It sounds like. You can switch it up if you want. We just need to like plus plus. No, that's fine. Yeah. So we're doing Harry, Anders, Jeremy. We're not. Jeremy's not that tiny. So it's Anders. Anybody else? Nope, that's it. Nice. No. So, yeah, you know exactly what I want to do. Oh, let's try mirroring the slide. Let's just right click in the background. So there's another. Yeah, display settings.
Okay, if you go around, so that.
Not more.
Okay. Oh.
Yeah.
Drop down. Yes.
Quickly drop down? Yeah. And then go to duplicate one. I don't know. Sure, yeah. Whoops. I guess it was 1 and 3. Nice.
Oh no.
Seems like she has a haircut. Sure, but.
Weird.
Okay. Oh, should we need a hurry to use it?
You can't do so great.
I'm going to do a 5-minute video call here in a minute.
You put it in off.
Alright. Well, I mean, I guess it's not a big
It's fine. She might be thinking.
deal. Yeah.
Hey.
Alright, thanks.
So this is Harry Hermes. Yeah, good to meet you too, bud.
Thank you, Becca. Very nice to meet you.
Yeah. Very well similar.
Let's see if I can find someone with a hairnet. It's a good change that.
Yeah, in fact.
Yeah.
Yeah. Are you ready to your step?
Hey, Jim. I'm doing all right. Sure thing.
So glad you're here. Glad
Yeah.
you did it.
Yeah, I just
Yes, sir.
Take this to amendment.
Yep.
Congratulations on your second. Congratulations.
Thank you. Congratulations, y'all. Job on me.
Yeah.
Hey, Morris. You all set in here?
I'm gonna do MC interview, but do you have Harry's presentation in there? We'll see it.
You don't see Harry's presentation?
Yeah.
He's up next to
Yeah,
you.
it is. At least next time.
Do you know where Harry is?
Oh, he just went to the thing, I was like, I don't know about it. I think
He'll be coming back up?
Yeah. Yeah, he said it.
He's talking next time. Harry's on his way back.
Okay, cool.
We're gonna start playing the music, get people to move and transition. If you need more shares in here,
Yeah.
we can drag a bunch more in it. And people, you're welcome to also like change the layout any way you want.
Yeah, just start doing the music things now, I guess, that people know.
Yeah.
I'm gonna have to drop off here in a minute, but I'll be available by Messenger for commentary back and forth.
Okay, so what's your reaction? I think you've seen all the information or there.
Yeah, it definitely feels. I don't know whether this is true or not, especially given like location and urban and other types of stuff like that. But that's from a price per square foot perspective, but it feels more overpriced on something.
Sorry?
Is this Blueberry then?
Yes.
It belongs to
It's only
Please.
Has some. Oh yes, I want. You know where the melon is?
Yeah, you go outside here and then turn left.
Hi, Joe.
Go through.
Not the two.
Oh, perfect.
He was at
Hi, are you setting up the slides?
Yes, so where did you have your presentation?
I just uploaded it to the thing. This is money, PowerPoint.
Test, test.
Roll around.
Oh, I would rather run.
This one works.
Hooray. I think that's what this goes back. It's not that long. Oh, I can just. Oh, I guess we're recording as well.
Test, 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 test.
everyone in the Linux Linux users group. Not, you know, not the bay down there, but Cambridge Bay. Like, in the
Test. 1, 2, 3. Hello.
So we really, I can talk loud enough to hit the room. So we really only need, yeah, we really only need the online screen. So I'm on the yellow one. Yeah.
All right, that works great. And then just turn that volume way, way down. So there's no feedback. Right.
I just went bowling.
All right. Oh, too loud. Too loud. How about that? Yeah, that's great. All right. So.
I was, you know,
Close the door now.
oh, I did that. I know people are still the post rationality.
If they want to come in,
Yeah. You're really excited. I think I have a long comment on there or something.
Oh, okay.
Scott Alexander created an app.
Yeah.
Different online blogs, and then I think you and you decided what that was.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, I wrote
Right. Hello, everybody. We're going to get started now. My name is Moritz Bierling. I'm kind of helping out with the emceeing for the afternoon in this room, the Blueberry room. So if you see other talks later on, I'll be also here. And if you have questions, feel free to come over and ask me. The next speaker is Harry Potash. He's going to be speaking on the mutable mythologies of money. Take it away.
All right, great. And thank you so much. I really appreciate your setting everything up. It's hugely helpful. All right, guys. So I'd really like this to be sort of a little bit more interactive, especially in the big rooms. There's a manageable number of us. I think having it kind of come as more of a discussion is going to be a lot more fun and a lot more interesting. So I'm going to talk about kind of some of the weird mythologies that underpin money, that make money work. And then more than anything, I'm just going to go through a bunch of different currencies or things that sometimes people think of in the same terms as money, and talking about what some of their traits are and what some of their myths are. So the first question I want to address is, why is money useful? Not to an individual, but like, why is it something that is sort of helpful for a society? Why does it tend to not go away once you have it? And my answer, oh God, that's terrible. All right, so coordination of effort. Also, apparently all of my little text slides have been re-rendered by Windows into black on black. So it's okay, it's mostly a picture show, mostly I'm talking. So the big advantage of money to a society is it's a great way of coordinating effort, right? It's kind of a pneumatic system that allows large groups of people to work together. There are other ways of coordinating effort. One of the big ones is hierarchy. You can coordinate large groups of people with hierarchy. Dogma is another really effective way. So laws, religious beliefs, rules, customs. So the other question is, what is the central myth of money? The one like critical thing that you need to believe about money and people need to believe about it for it to work, right? Because it's just little pieces of paper or bits or something, right? It's not inherently functional. And in my opinion, the core myth about money that needs to work is that everybody needs to believe that everybody else wants it. If you don't believe that other people want your money, then it doesn't work. And that's got to be a common belief, right? So you need to know it, and you need to know that everyone else knows it. There's an interesting side effect of that, because if everybody wants money, it also means that you need almost everybody in your society to feel like they're kind of poor, right? It means that everyone's got to have that sort of clawing desire for more money. And if everyone doesn't feel a little bit poor, at least, then the whole money thing stops working, and you end up with a very different looking society, something more like a honor culture, or a very traditional, like Buddhist monks don't really feel the need for money and don't really use it. So pretty much every single cryptocurrency presentation starts off by talking about the different traits of money that they're going to talk about. I was watching Silicon Valley like as it aired, and I was like, oh look, it's my presentation. I choose to use 9. There's not an official number. I'm going to just kind of buzz through these really quickly. If there are any questions about any of them, please slow me down, raise a hand, and I'd love to have discussions. There are some really interesting ways to drill into them. But acceptability, I think we all know what this means. People take it. Portability, right? Gold is heavy. Actually, gold used to be a really good form of portability back when technology was a little less developed. So it's a lot of these things are moving targets. Now we consider gold not portable, right? Divisibility, right? Like you should be able to subdivide it. Recognizability, you should be able to tell when it's a real thing pretty easily, right? So US currency is pretty recognizable. Fungibility, one piece of the thing should be interchangeable for another. If I have a $100 bill and you have a $100 bill, I'm happy to swap them, it doesn't matter to me, right? If I have a Honda and you have a Honda, we're not happy to swap them. Durability. It's nice if your money doesn't just sort of break down while you're holding it. Difficulty to produce, right? There's a problem if it's too easy to make the money. This is kind of the bead economy that was present in the United States before Westerners showed up. When they talk about tribesmen trading things for glass beads, there was actually large regions where beads were the currency, and they were just difficult to produce. And then Westerners showed up who had a technology for producing glass beads really easily, and all of a sudden it was like, oh, they showed up with like stacks of $100 bills, right? So difficult to produce is a good thing. Theft resistant, right? This is actually one of the more interesting ones because you kind of want it to be both theft resistant and seizure resistant, right? So you don't want some random criminal to be able to steal it from you easily, but you also generally don't want the government or legitimate authorities to just be able to take it away. But those two things play against each other. So if something is very easy to seize, like say your bank account, if someone steals it from you, then you just petition the government, they go, oh yeah, that's totally illegitimate, and seize it and give it back, right? But it is possible to do both of those things. And then finally, stability of value, right? It's sort of messy if prices move 10% in a day, which is topical now. So I also have a sort of cast of characters who I have commentaries from. There's sort of the common mythology of money, the one that people who are not thinking about that particular type of currency hold, right? I use Homer Simpson to say that. That's sort of the dollar is a dollar outlook. There's a sort of trader viewpoint who's got a very, very detailed mechanical knowledge of the underlying myth of money and how all of its details work, but he doesn't really question it. He's just using it to try and get as much money as he can, right? And then there's this sort of philosopher stoner approach where he's just like, hey, it's all just pieces of green paper, man, right? Which is pretty much where I live. Okay, so the kind of granddaddy of money is gold, right? And I'm going to use these spider charts through the whole thing, right? So this is basically an area chart. It's got one of each of the traits along each axis, and then you can kind of see how well it does as a general purpose currency by how big the blob it makes is. You can also see where it's weak or strong.
What are the bottom two?
Yeah, so at the bottom, this is durability, and this is fungibility. And I'm sorry about the slide issue. Teach me to export to PowerPoint. Or at least do it without checking. Right? So gold is great. Like I said, portability has been a moving target. It used to be up top for portability, right? It used to be one of the more portable things you could use as a store of value. But it's huge. If you look at that, it almost takes up the whole spider chart, right? It's really durable. It's really, it's seizure resistant. You can bury it in your backyard, etc. I'm also going to just try and fly through these so we can have a longer Q&A session, right? So gold is great. Sometimes you'll hear people say that it has intrinsic value, right? You make electronics and stuff with it. That's pretty much not true. Gold doesn't, I mean, it does have some intrinsic value in electronics, but it's valued way above that. All right, so the next one up is the US dollar, right? Circa like 1900 to 1950. Before that, we had bimetallic backing. It was very complicated. But we went to a gold-backed dollar in 1900, right? People seem to think that it was gold-backed forever before Nixon. That's totally not true. It's changed what it was many times. A gold-backed dollar kind of makes a lot of sense. They're saying gold is the granddaddy of currency. Here's just a piece of paper that says, I'll give you some money for it, right? Should be bulletproof. The problem is that several times, almost like clockwork, every 25 or 30 years, they ended up changing the amount of gold that your dollar was backed by, right? So the deal keeps changing. It's an interesting myth, right? The myth is that the money is worth a certain amount of gold that's held, but you have to trust the person who's holding the gold and conducting the exchange. So then we had the Bretton Woods Accord, right? So basically after World War II, a whole bunch of different countries got together and agreed to fix all of their currencies to a gold-backed currency, right? And fix them relative to each other. And the net result of that was a really stable currency because you couldn't just repeg it whenever you wanted to, right? Because there were a bunch of other treaty members who got upset at that. It's a little bit like the euro, but totally not. Also created the IMF as a side effect, which meant that not only was your money backed by gold, right, pretty much exactly as the common man thought it was, but also your loans were backed by a large institution, which made large-scale fiscal stability work a lot better. That worked for a while until some other things sort of spun out of control. The modern US dollar, right, under Nixon, I bet a lot of people know this. Under Nixon, it switched to not being gold-backed anymore. It's just a free-floating dollar. The dollar is worth what we say it's worth because it is. So again, you see the production challenge goes down a whole lot, right? Because now you don't have to have gold to make it. And stability of value goes down a bit. So it's been pretty stable. So what actually makes a US dollar worth something? In my opinion, yeah, basically. So it's sort of a two-factor thing, right? There's a guy with some really big guns, right, Uncle Sam, and also he collects taxes in it, right? So there's always one person who wants your money.
And issues bonds.
Yes, which is basically another flavor of similar currency.
Well, it's more relevant for the non-taxpayers.
Right. So there is always a buyer for U.S. currency. In some cases, he's buying it by not throwing you in prison or not giving it to him.
What about petroleum? Petroleum.
So are you talking about just the general concept of the petrodollar? Yeah, so I would say that is true, but that's sort of operating at an additional level of like overlaid complexity. And let's bring that back up at the end. All right, so then there's the myth of the US dollar bank account, right? You put your money in the bank in the US somewhere. The sort of naive view of that, and you can see I put it like all the way down on theft resistance, because if the government wants to seize your bank account, it's just done, right? I don't know if any of you have ever tried to cash out or cash in large amounts of cryptocurrency, but it's a frightening experience sometimes. The sort of simple view of that is you put your money in the bank and the bank holds your money, and it's just sort of there, right? It's a account backed by a US dollar. You pretty quickly realize that it's actually fractional reserve banking. They only hold 10% of what you give them, and they just really hope that you don't all come and take your money out at the same time. And then there's a government institution backing that further. Stock is something that sometimes people think of as currency or a currency alternative. It's not a bad investment, right? The myth is that you own some of the company, but you can kind of see how it ends up not fulfilling a lot of the like liquidity desirable traits of money, right? It's kind of a small thing. You can't subdivide it. It's got problems with divisibility, acceptability. Most people won't take it. The company can just print more. But the common myth of it, which is that you own a fraction of the company, is actually pretty close to true. Like as you drill through it, it's not that far off. The value of it is totally not derived from that. And there's this sort of interesting myth that the market is highly functional and that things are valued almost exactly correctly, right? Anyone who tells you that you should buy just buy an index fund because you can't outguess the market is sort of saying that. In reality, the market is not an efficient market, right? I don't know if any of you were paying attention recently when Long Island Iced Tea renamed themselves the Long Blockchain Company and immediately tripled in value. And then like it took another couple of months for everyone to figure it out, and it immediately like dropped catastrophically in value. And then they're getting kicked off the NASDAQ for that stuff now. Yeah, or at least it's like the third time they're trying to kick them off the NASDAQ for that stock. It's in courts. Right, like that kind of stunt works totally well. Markets are not efficient. They are efficient in maybe the very long run, possibly, but there's a lot of fun there. All right, so diamonds. I feel like diamonds are worth mentioning because this is a really great case where the myth is like traceable and manufactured, right? So diamonds are thought to be, diamonds are forever. They're thought to be extremely durable. They're actually not durable at all. You can throw one in a fire and it burns, right? It's made out of carbon. Their value was specifically and intentionally manufactured by the De Beers family, right? I think a lot of people know this. In reality, diamonds are incredibly easy to produce now. And if you buy one and then try and sell it back, it loses 80% of its value immediately, right? I actually often wonder if that's sort of the greatest scam that was ever pulled. Black pearls are sort of similar deal. They were worthless until someone marketed them well. diamonds are also not fungible and in general would make a terrible currency. So now I want to just sort of start talking about some interesting fiat currency edge cases. First of which is the Zimbabwe dollar. I have been to Zimbabwe and picked up a few souvenirs. Hyperinflation is a real thing. Governments overprint their currency all the time. Zimbabwe went a little bit farther with it than most countries go before they bail out. They actually got up to $100 trillion notes. I have the whole sequence. It's one of my like fun collector's pieces. But once the common man sort of stops believing that your money is valuable, it just tanks at an unbelievable speed. So the Argentinian peso, this is not true anymore, but about 3 years ago it was true. They were having a hyperinflation problem, and their solution was to simply say, okay, it's illegal to not trade the peso at $1 to 8 pesos. And what ended up happening is they ended up with what they called the blue rate, which is everyone understood that the floating rate of the peso was not what they were legally required to trade it at. And I also was in Buenos Aires at the time when they were doing this. And it was really weird, right? If you went into any formal institution, if you went to a bank or anything like that, you'd be forced to use this horrible conversion rate. They wouldn't take pesos back for dollars, right? But you could walk into like a department store, and in the back of the department store there would be an illegal bank, which looked exactly like a bank, right? Tellers, like money counters, security guard, totally legit looking. That was a blue rate bank, and they would change your money at the blue rate, which was about 13 to 1. It also meant that there was clearly credit card infrastructure in the entire country, and everyone refused to use it. There was horrible shortages on cash. The whole economy was a mess. I don't know if you remember the discussion a little bit earlier today on some countries eventually moving to cryptocurrency, just sort of de facto, but a situation like this would have been a really obvious one. They had moved to the US dollar, just sort of de facto. Also, Zimbabwe moved to the US dollar, just sort of de facto. Yes, Jordan?
So Cuba and to a lesser extent China both have had tiered currency situations as well. Like in Cuba, there's sort of explicit external versus internal currencies, and you couldn't really take the internal currency and then convert to US dollars. You could spend it domestically, and then you had to have a special kind of currency if you want to actually like change money and go out.
Yeah, this actually happens shockingly often, right? Each of these are just kind of categorical examples of something that happens a lot. Cuba does this, China does this. Sort of South Korea, though it's more like money movement laws, which if you've ever noticed, like on the cryptocurrency exchanges, there's often a huge gap between what the Koreans are paying for a currency and what the US is, or everyone else is really. That's because of that. France had this happen at one point, though that was pre-World War II. So this happens, right? And hyperinflation happens. And basically, I do see a sort of world where cryptocurrency will be sitting there when these things happen and kind of de facto slide in. Because central governments do weird things. I don't know if any of you have followed recently the demonetization thing in India. This was literally in December, right? This was November, December, just, what is that, 6 months ago? So this is an interesting one because it's an indication of like how hierarchy and money interplay and how fiat money is just sort of an expression of hierarchy in a lot of ways. Literally, overnight, well, I guess it more or less overnight, right? Overnight in November, middle of November, they sort of declared all $1,000 or all 1,000 rupee and 500 rupee bills are no longer going to be money. You have to turn them all into a bank right now, right? As of December, we won't even take them at the banks. it's just gone, right? They didn't have the infrastructure to make that sort of exchange. They didn't have the bills to replace them. You were only allowed to withdraw bills at a really slow rate. I think it was 2,000 rupees a day. My wife knows. 2,000 rupees a day. And what's worse than that, they were also talking about doing a bail-in for the banks. You probably know what the phrase of a bailout is, where a bank becomes insolvent and the government loans them a ton of money. A bail-in is where a bank becomes insolvent and the government says, you know what, it's okay, you can just take your depositor's money and use that to make yourself solvent again, right? So demonetization is a thing, and what do you think would happen if they had just said, you know what, gold is no longer money, you have to turn your gold into the bank, it doesn't work anymore. Nope. They did that, right? Like, they do that all the time. It doesn't work. Because money has value that's not derived from government statement and wanting to collect taxes in it. All right, so onto the cryptocurrencies. Bitcoin around 2012, and this is an interesting thing, right? Because the mythology that underpins money changes. The same way the US had a different mythology, the gold-backed mythology in 1900 than it did in 1990. Bitcoin had a drastically different mythology in 2012 than it does now, right? In 2012, the mythology was all about the sort of crypto-anarchist dream that we were talking about before. Totally unregulatable, a way to fight back against big government, et cetera, right? Basically, no one accepted it. The value was also still not stable then, right? The price fluctuations were still there. It just swung between like $5 and $6 instead of $15,000 and $20,000. So it is pretty cool. It was cool then. Now in 2018, it's getting really much more acceptable, right? I mean, even when people won't take Bitcoin directly, there are a lot of interface layers that kind of let you get to it and spend it. It's got most of the same traits. It's still not stable in value. It's also, as I would put it, it's a poorly regulated, highly volatile asset with no obvious oversight and lots of uninformed investors, right? It's basically a giant piranha tank right now. We can talk about Ethereum in 2015. Ethereum was still pretty much just a new pipe dream kind of thing. The myth was it was going to be a totally immutable online ecosystem for new currencies. What was really interesting is the immutability myth of cryptocurrencies kind of got challenged in Ethereum. I don't know if any of you know very much about the DAO hack and the subsequent hard fork, but this is one of those really fascinating things because it came right down to the bare bones of like money being a way of coordinating effort and an underlying mythology. When someone stole enough Ethereum in one go, the community said, all right, so it's only immutable to the extent that we aren't all willing to just like pretend that didn't happen collectively. And everyone organized collectively, well, almost everyone organized collectively. There was a small contingent of Ethereum Classic holdouts and said, you know what, we can just fix this by rewriting history. And that's actually really cool. It challenges the underlying assumption of how that works, right? So the other interesting thing with that is Ethereum had that whole you can spin up a token in like 10 minutes process. I actually was going to do that in the workshop, but decided it was maybe a little too big. But people sort of went, oh, if it's just a sort of consensus basis, and anyone can make a currency, I'll make a currency too, right? And so come 2018, Ethereum is a little bit more acceptable, but it has spawned an ocean of shitcoins, right? Everybody's got their own currency, and most of them are really awful. Because it takes 10 minutes to do, and people have confused can do it and get by it. All right, so one other one I want to talk about is Tether, right? You heard some mention of a stable coin, or the idea that stability is a really desirable asset in value. There are 3 ways you can accomplish that. The previous presentation this morning was only talking about one of them. The most basic way to make a stable coin is to just have it be a backed asset. The mythology behind Tether is that there is a bank account somewhere that has, $1 for every Tether that's been issued, right? We don't know whether that bank is theoretically using fractional reserve accounting or not, because the problem with the Tether system is that no one can audit those banks because the people holding it won't let them. Actually, there are a couple of problems. Also, even assuming that they do have all that money in bank accounts and it was auditable, it's still then totally controlled by a central point, can be seized, right? So theft resistance goes right back down to 0 and has all sorts of similar problems. And then, besides Tether, the other one that's sort of worth mentioning in the stablecoin realm, right? Because it's nice to not have to transact in a massively fluctuating currency, is DAI, which is, you'll sometimes hear it referred to as MakerDAO, which is the sort of parent company. DAI is sort of the same idea as Tether, right? Only they've got a kind of clever way of using smart contracts and totally decentralized, making a set of value where you back it with Ethereum, and then it guards against fluctuations in value of Ethereum through, what is essentially a tranching system, right? Sort of like the same way that there was a tranching system with the 2008 asset crashes, though it's a much simpler one. And I would actually say that DAI has most of, right, the only real thing it's missing at the moment is acceptability, as far as being a almost completely spider chart filling currency for the modern era. There's not really a lot of way to make a ton of money off of DAI, right? Because it's a stable coin, so it doesn't fluctuate wildly. But it's pretty valuable. And then here I just have a spider chart comparing some of the big ones that I've talked about, right? You can see sort of gold up there that's not very portable in gold, and Bitcoin, and that's really weak on stable value. And then the US dollar, which has a bunch of problems in the theft-resistant production challenge area. And then DAI in red, that's just not accepted anywhere.
Hey, DAI is stable with respect to what?
DAI is pegged to the dollar, but the way they set it up, and also their announced intent, is that anyone can issue it will issue a basket of different stable coins that are pegged to different things. So
that's how DAI is actually more stable than US dollars?
Yes.
That's what they started?
Right.
Okay.
So you can peg DAI, so they will have a gold peg DAI. It'll use the same mechanism. It will always move in parity with gold. You can have etc. And then also it's worth sort of pointing out that the US dollar is not super ridiculously stable. We also don't know how stable DAI will actually be because it's got to withstand some much larger fluctuations, but it did handle a 70% crash in underlying asset without really hiccuping, which is really good, right? Like that, I mean, the US dollar can't do that. Nothing I know of anywhere else has done Yeah,
Do you have all the area numbers for all those spider charts?
I do not, and part of the reason why is all of the numbers for the various scales I just pulled out of my butt. So deriving second order statistics from them seems sort of underproductive. Yeah.
Can you just clarify what you just, that statement you just made about the US dollar can't handle that? Can't handle what?
I would say that my guess is that it's the underlying value propositions behind the US dollar, which in this case would probably be the US economy or the US military structure, fell by 70% over a week. The US dollar would probably not hold steady in value.
Then neither would not.
What does it mean for that to fall by 70%?
That's a much messier question in the case of the US dollar, right? Because the US dollar is mostly derived, in my opinion, it derives a lot of its value from the ability of the US government to collect taxes in it. That's why people tend to want it. Or at least it's the sort of desirer of last resort. So I would say the US economy, right? Or the US projected tax revenues, yeah. I'm not going to go to the mat for that definition. Almost everything in this presentation is sort of a starting point for conversation rather than a like deeply thought out thing. Great. So I was really hoping to get some good conversation going, and I totally don't mean to shut down what might be a really interesting, picky argument, which I totally want to have, because I think that's where a lot of things come out of. Anyone have any questions about diamonds or area charts or multi-tiered currency?
I have a question. So you mentioned previously, like when you were making the argument for Bitcoin, that one way that you get acceptability is kind of infrastructure or related services around it. So even if you can't pay for something with Bitcoin, you can now sort of do it because there are other mechanisms that kind of get you there. Does that sort of, so if that's the case, assuming that kind of this infrastructure around acceptability keeps growing, does that sort of, are there some of these axes that you sort of get from technology, do you think? Or,
Oh, totally, right? Like, I mean, portability comes almost entirely from technology.
Wrong way to say, I guess, in a way, you could just say that the acceptability axis is a short-term problem for all cryptocurrencies. There's one way to use it, right?
Right.
Eventually, they all go to like the max that you could get in these categories. Is that?
So right. The question is, I guess there's a couple questions wrapped up in there. One of the questions is, and I'm repeating it for the web audience, is the acceptability a short-term problem for all of the cryptocurrencies? I would say yes, totally. It's a short-term problem for almost all currencies, almost all of the time, right? Until it's sort of the de facto currency, until people trust it, it's not accepted, right? Sometimes even past then, right? Gold has an acceptability problem as well. If I go to 7-Eleven with a gold coin, they stare at me blankly. So the second question is, does technology move past that in a lot of ways, right? Does this sort of technological middlemen reduce acceptability? And I would say in a lot of ways it does, right? In a sufficiently advanced market, whether it's kind of digital technology or whether it's just like having a really flexible assets market that can do a lot of fancy transformations and is running quickly, it does produce that liquidity, right? So I think that's what people mean when they talk about liquidity. So for instance, the Apple stock, which I said was a terrible currency because it had low acceptability, sort of works for that because you know you can sell it on the open market and move it to money and then spend that money on a house, right? So the guy won't give you a house for Apple stock, but you can get there. And you can get there pretty quickly because it's a liquid market. Conversely, something that is relatively illiquid doesn't have that. I'm trying to think of a good illiquid asset. Yeah, classic cars are a great example. If you might have a beautiful old T-Bird or something valuable, and you can sell it eventually, but you can't get the house when you want it. Okay? Yes? Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so what I learned from this is the way that you talked about and didn't talk about security is really interesting. Theft resistance, your theft resistance axis seems to be into the idea of like bank robbing, whereas what you didn't mention, which is super interesting, maybe you realize that it's one of the key issue there, it's also like working in production right now, or at least part of the movement, is that like cryptocurrencies, it's sort of like it forces individuals to have to enact bank level security. And so theft resistance sort of is converted from like an institutional problem to an individual problem, which is super interesting. So like I'm actually not sure that Bitcoin, for instance, ranks high, where it's like it sort of depends on the case. And then the other thing that cryptocurrency adds to the equation, which is kind of interesting, is like is also institutional security questions. So we could say the U.S. dollar is somewhat well, there's something in between theft resistance and stability, which is basically like resistance to interference from state-level actors.
Right.
And that would be fun to talk about.
Yeah. So I kind of, when I got most of the way through this, realized that I should break theft resistance out into two different lines, but that they would. I kind of kept going back and forth on that because of what you just said. They're almost always going to flip back and forth. You need to institute bank level security on your person. I would actually say it's closer to instituting cash level security on your person, right? If you've got a $100 bill or a gold coin, it is still not secure against theft in the ways you're talking about, right? But you don't need bank level security, you just sort of need the appropriate amount of risk tolerance.
You kind of do because you have scalable security exploits. So like,
right.
Like you can't rob 100,000 homes at the same time, but you can.
Okay, I would argue
my wallet is not internet connected.
Right. So yeah. I would say that I use a physical hard physical wallet.
Yeah.
Before that, I used paper wallets.
I mean, does your proverbial mother have that?
Right, and she certainly doesn't right now. And ultimately, I have it all backed up on paper wallets. They're sitting in a bank, so
yeah.
So there's the bank level security again. But yeah, it's a major concern. And then, so mostly my chart revealed how hard it is for state-level actors to seize it. So I want to go to you because you.
I just want to see if you could break down acceptability versus recognizability. I can't see how something would be acceptable without also being recognizable.
Okay, so if I were to try and spend, how about Japanese yen with you right now? The problem would be, you might be pretty willing to accept them, right? Like if I was like, hey, I just got back from Japan, I don't have any cash on me, can you just like take this, right? You're like, oh yeah, the yen is a totally acceptable currency, but you've just never seen it before.
Okay, got it.
And you're like, yeah, looks legit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you think cryptocurrency changes the definition of
So no, not at all, right?
So
for me.
Add programmability, right? Add different elements.
Yeah, you can totally add desirable traits to these. These 9 traits are not like some great canonical thing passed down through generations, much like the values I put on them. I just kind of pulled them out of my ear. This is getting gradually more PG as I go. So yeah, I think we expect our money to do more and more things, and that this spider chart keeps growing. And the same way I was talking, gold used to be incredibly portable, right? You were like, oh wow, I just need like one brick of this and I can move like several villages worth of output, you know, in my moderately sized backpack. Now we consider that unreasonable, right? So I would say programmability is definitely a thing. I would say like the ability to do smart contracts and operate, though the smart contracts thing kind of interacts with the like not being seizable space.
There seems to be an ever-growing long tail of coins, right?
Yeah.
At no end. Is there some sort of, I can see where the mass public gradually gets more acceptance and recognizing certain of these coins, but then the net effect of more coins being added kind of confuses the marketplace. And so exerts some downward pressure on the recognizability, acceptability of some of these coins that are, especially newer coins.
Yeah.
Do you have anything to say about like a dynamic like that where people in general become more acceptable, but then go to the marketplace and really have no idea of which coins to value?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's largely already happened, right? I would say that out of like, so I was like really fascinated by cryptocurrencies starting in like 2011, right? Me and my roommates, I've got these fascinating transaction logs where I like bought my roommate a sandwich for 3 Bitcoin, right? And, yeah, exactly, by far, right? And vice versa. And back then it was like a really fairly navigable space in that sense. There was like 1 or 2 big ideas moving around and you could kind of track it. At this point, I don't even pay attention to most of the cryptocurrency space because I can't, right? Like the signal has been buried in noise, right? It would be a full-time job. It would be more than a full-time job, right? You basically need a small institution to sort of sit through it. And I think that's roughly what you're talking about. So for me, it's all become unrecognizable except for like maybe the top 5 or 6 plus ones that people I personally know have created, right? So yeah, and I think that's a natural pattern, right? It's very similar to the stock market. Recognizability decays as the number of things go up, and the myth sort of gets spread out. I also think that you're going to see a tremendous shakeout when a lot of the sort of modern get-rich-quick myth goes away, because everyone's just sort of hoping to get lucky and get really rich by picking the lottery ticket.
I have to stop here, or you can just continue if you want to do the conversation. But yeah, we have some breaks, so those who do want to kind of take a break for toilet or whatever, feel free.
Okay, great. I really do want to get these next 2 questions.
I wanted to ask about dollarization versus, so imagine you have an economy that has really bad hyperinflation or something.
Yeah.
Right now, or in the past 2 decades, the historic need switched to the dollar.
Right.
What would it take for them to, you said, what's missing? Why is the current management
So I would say 2 things, right? One, there's a massive technological overhead to be using cryptocurrency. It's actually kind of messy and painful, and the acceptance is really low. And then the second thing is basically comparative volatility, right? The US dollar is, in most people's head, incredibly stable, right? And all of the cryptocurrency space is incredibly volatile, right? So generally, if you're coming out of a currency that's volatile and dangerous, you're not going to flee into a currency that's volatile and dangerous. I think probably the the thing that would cause that to happen would be for there to be a severe movement in the U.S. dollar, probably a severe downward movement in the U.S. dollar that sort of shook everyone's confidence in it, and then everything would flee into something else, and I think cryptocurrency would probably be a solid contender. I think the more people get into like the doomsday scenario space, the more they end up in cryptocurrency. And I'm so interested in your question, actually.
So that, I mean, I missed the first part, so maybe you have this, but this term value gets thrown around a lot in these scenes. And is often seen to be synonymous with the concept of price, and which I make a categorical distinction between these concepts. So when you say value, what exactly are you referring to in that particular context? So like, how do you conceive of value?
So
in relation to money?
I'm using that phrase in a incredibly loose way, especially as I speak kind of extemporaneously. I think you're totally right that it should be broken down into price and productive capacity, right? Like the ability for it to sort of produce coordinated effort in a useful way to the overarching society. I suspect that when I used it, I was going back and forth between price and usability, but I think mostly during this talk I was talking about price.
I think maybe it's the reason why it might be important is that a lot of these conversations about, a lot of money conversations have this assumption, and again I didn't see the list, but start from this idea that there's three functions of money, and then kind of like work back from that. And it's sort of just assume that these three functions exist. And often say like, if something fulfills those functions, then it is money. So the definition, you start off with this function, and then you kind of like say, well, therefore, if, for example, I use an Apple share to engage in a transaction, it's money.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like, but what is Apple shares priced in? Apple shares are priced in US dollars. All right. So an Apple share is a derivative of another money system. So is that exactly the same as the money system? So it might do the same thing, but you have these kind of like layers of stuff. All those stable coins are all backed by some other thing. So that it's kind of like forming like a consistent notion of what the actual layers of quote-unquote value are is quite important, I think. And I think in the cryptocurrency community in general, I think this issue isn't really described often. It's just like the mere fact of being able to sort of engage in a transaction with some kind of thing makes it money, even though it's dependent upon the underlying money systems to gain access to the actual physical goods and services.
Right. Yeah, no, I totally follow you. So that's also sort of an interesting conversation, which I was talking with Brendan about earlier, which is, you know, if it moves through other things to gain acceptability, right? If I can seamlessly trade my Bitcoin for US bank dollars, for regular dollars, and then for soda, is that really acceptable? Does that make Bitcoin acceptable money? That's an interesting question. As far as definition of money goes, I sort of, with most definitions, hold to a very kind of, I strongly accept semantic fuzziness, right? I think that we have a general pattern as humans in language to use things that mostly kind of match archetypes on a lot of vectors as like we say, okay, then that's kind of, this is kind of bird-shaped, so I'm going to call it a bird, right? And it has huge problems when you get down into scientific work, but it actually works pretty well, and I think is the underpinning of how language works as like a metaphor.
In money theory communities, you find this concept of moneyness,
yeah,
which is sort of like something that's kind of money-like, but isn't quite money, but sort of seems to operate in the same way. So, for example, like the repo markets or like US dollar bonds. I mean, what is a US bond? It's a promise of future money. But that bond in itself then becomes essentially can be used to as money, so it's got like a money miss to it.
Right.
So you could be arguing a lot of these things have certain forms of money miss.
I would, yeah, that would be exactly what I'm arguing. I would argue that all of them have some level of moneyness, and I was sort of picking through ones that maybe don't, like diamonds kind of seem like they might have moneyness and are terrible, right? So I think actually that's what the spider chart is. It's like by area, I'm sort of trying to claim how much moneyness they have, and I think I'm also indicating that some of the canonical ones don't do that much better than some of the modern ones, but that's according to the criteria I just made up right now.
I think we're going to use the remaining 5 minutes for the change in the slides, but you guys can continue the conversation in the...
Thanks.
I'd like to talk. I was wondering if you sometimes learn a lot more about theory like that theory. I was wondering if there are like particular starting places or books you recommend for to go from planetary theory to planetary theory, I guess. I don't know. I mean, I don't even know the definitions of these terms.
Yeah. You didn't go into it, so it was like waiting, and then like, oh, it's good. But
it was similar more about what you were saying this morning, like how did you learn things that you were talking about?
There's a short problem. Right?
Should I just start with games? Or is there like a picture of games?
And yeah, they cannot have
It's a early Christmas. Yeah, I read
Where are you?
Alright, that's good.
You absolutely.
Yeah.
Just hold it. Just hold it.
Great, yeah. Perfect. Yes, sounds good. Right, yeah, I was reading like the article about in Ireland or something, there was a bench fight.
It's a very classic example. It's like a complete
There was a much more.
I would actually argue that the original understanding like there are a lot of designed to have in the society.
We're going to start in 2 minutes, so just so you know.
I guess I'll plug it then. Go ahead.
Yeah.
So I need to run to find my base.
New Zealand. Yeah. Delete. Pretty cool. Yeah. Have you heard of Queenstown? Yeah. It's 3 hours from Queenstown. Southeast on the coast.
Yeah, it's a work of art.
But yeah, I didn't come from there. I'm actually in London. I came from London. Yeah. Also far away, but not as far away. Yeah.
Alright, I think we're going to start shortly, so if you want to take your seats and get ready. This talk is a pleasure for me to present because it's by a good friend of mine, Anders Ahmed. He and I met last year in Liechtenstein at a hackathon for a project that he's a part of that he will tell us about. And Anders is going to talk about a subject with a hell of a title that I have to look into the schedule for. Excavating the post-capitalist subject, dark chain technology and eventually consistent myth-making. So he's going to try to explain what that means, so please welcome him and give him to the stage.
Hello? There we go. So yeah, meanwhile there is another session on the unintelligibility or illegibility of the blockchain. So this is hopefully legible, but if it's illegible, that's actually part of the game, is figuring out what it means. And illegibility also serves as camouflage. So, xenogaming. First, I have to give a warning, time traveler sickness, Overton whiplash phenomenon, because we're pushing the Overton window and I'm taking that really seriously. I am trying to ground this presentation concretely in practical things, but usually people give me feedback that it's too much too fast, but that's kind of the point. So let me read this quote from the Udon Gnostic workbook. There are certain people who will sneer at what I have to say, but they do not matter. In fact, they do not really exist. But what I have to say is this. There are these mutants, and they are now within the most powerful magical orders and groups in the world today. They're slowly working to destroy utterly the old ways. They're making use of the most subtle methods of modern information science to achieve their ends. They're fearful of nothing, which means they only fear the powers of the Mayon, or Noumena, the non-existent. They possess the disciplined mentality of the synchronistic robotic consciousness and nothing else. They have only one loyalty, and they have only one sense of honor, and that too is to you, God, and only to you, God. And by means of their weird techniques of computer programming, they will win out over all their opposition, because ultimately there is only one fundamental power, and that too is you, God, or Pluto. What is xenogaming? This emergent game is already out there, feral as schizophrenia, and nascent in myths and nomics. What is xenogaming? It's immersive post-capitalist worlding. We don't have to wait for the world to become materially post-capitalist if we're already seeing the world as post-capitalist subjects. It's also an invasive outer world entity such as Yog-Sothoth trying to leak into our normal everyday life. A virulent parallel reality or contagious psychosis. Open source, peer-to-peer reality construction framework. It's a new kind of apocalyptic gig economy. And it's a holistic alternative mental health framework for emerging global alchemical society, a reconstitution of the planetary Illuminati that have been persecuted for the last 2,000 to 12,000 years by the alphabet. It's Escape from Capitalism, the game. Wouldn't this be a fun game for everyone in the world to play? Aren't we already playing it? What would gaming look like on Holochain? So I work for Holo, and we just finished our ICO. I'm coming here from the Holo team retreat where about 30 of us went to Colorado just now, and was more of a team fixing and training than a retreat, but it was really fun, and we reconnected. Our ICO raised 20 to 25 million, depending on how you count it and which currency, and that's small by ICO standards, but it's plenty for what we need to do. And we hit our cap, which is great. Yeah, so Holochain, for people who find explaining blockchains to their friends and family to be too easy. First, let me explain what is Holochain. I'm going to go over this really briefly because you can read about it online. Open source, it's an open source library that allows you to construct fully decentralized peer-to-peer applications. So the applications are talking to their peer applications that have exactly the same source code. If you change even one bit of the source code, you fork yourself into an alternate timeline or sidechain. There's no built-in currency into Holochain. That's much better. There's no built-in currency in Holochain. But we are building the Holo app, which will act as a cloud computer and have a currency built in on top of Holochain. And then we're going to explicitly help and have a huge community outreach. And I'm already part of this, I'm already working on this, to build our applications ecosystem. We're going to be helping people with a pipeline and helping to support people as they collect a team and build their app, and trying to prevent replication of labor by having people working on similar apps talk to each other. So basically, Holochain is for Deleuzian hacktivists, people who are excited about the rhizome and problematizing or complexifying or making spaces more messy and thus less prone to statist oversight. This is like the perfect technology for this population. So what would gaming on Holochain look like? Or what would gaming on fully decentralized technology look like? It'd be massively multiplayer. You would have collaboratively constructed rule sets. You wouldn't have a top-down or central authority on what the rules of the game are. Be more like an infinite game than a finite game, or a lot of finite games put together. You'd have highly coordinated flash mobs, spontaneous musicals, weird things in the street that nobody can understand except the players, potentially. You'd have peer-to-peer spreading of the game. And also, what would these games be about? They would be about sharing and replicating abundance. Because once you have abundance in your life, the only thing left to do that's like helping the world is to share that abundance that you have and get other people on board with being able to have abundance, in terms of like a global improvement project. And this thing I want to push is actually breaking down the distinction between playing games publicly, doing activism, and advertising. Because if someone is sharing their favorite TV show with you, is that advertising? It is from the show's point of view, but not from mine or my friends. So what if I told you the post-monetary economy is already here in a smeared hyper-real apocalypse, and you just need to invite yourself to the party? So this introduces ontoboarding, ontological onboarding. Yeah, so it's compare with waterboarding or surfboarding. We're going to do your crystal implant installation. We're going to get you all hooked up. We're going to assimilate you to the board. We're going to give you your dollhouse architecture. We're going to cyborgify you in a ritual. So I have another one of these that says literally real. And we're going to scan you into the game, portal you into an alternate reality, help you to cross membranes. And this is all like psychopumping, mythologically speaking, bringing people from one worldview to another. So what would the post-capitalist subject look like? First of all, this is similar to saying post-capitalism. It doesn't really exist. Post-capitalism is still within capitalism, which just means organisms need to eat to survive. They need to eat more than they put out to survive. So similarly, you can go beyond the Oedipal subject. I'm a psychologist, but you can't, if you deconstruct the Oedipal subject, that's just regression. But you can have multiple subjects, you can have partial subjects, you can have all kinds of interesting modifications onto what it means to say the word I. Then these are what's more types of ways to be a person. Transpersonal subjectivity, post-identity politics. So we'll finally get beyond stupid identity politics like anti-feminism versus pro-feminism, and like these things where it's like obviously there's one side that's the loving side and one side that's like the vicious side, and then if you flip them around, it's obviously true the other way as well. if you look at like alt-right dialectics and stuff like that. Consensual self-construction. So how do we create religious zealots like these holo people? Why can't our marketing team do this? We need to create a sky cult too. And I am on the cutting edge of this sky cult. Dank praxis, facets of xenogaming. So this is the practical portion actually. I'm going to try and go through this really fast so you can see the practical grounding, and then I'll try and get into the dark chain stuff more. So yeah, there are 5 aspects. You can see them here: viral weird marketing, cross-pollination, protocol design, and cross-pollination. Neo-digital outreach, which is connecting with local activist communities and telling them you are already living in a digital world right now. And hackerspace replication, meaningful gamification, and an apps pipeline, which is grounding all of this. So what would our world be like if all military spending were redirected to the creation of next-level party technology? This is from Greg and, what's his name? Greg and Tom's Decentralized Dance Party. By the way, I will be probably at DogeCon, if anyone wants to go to DogeCon, in June, I think, June 21st to 24th. Weird and viral marketing. So this is memes, mythos, humor, Xeno. There's just these weird things coming in from the side that nobody predicted, things going better than we expected, and weird stories that we didn't come up with, we kind of discovered them. Yeah, so acceleration is like 5 clocks. These are the cross-pollinators. They are cross-pollinating the peer-to-peer, fully decentralized protocols that are part of our already existing decentralized secret organization. Bees, rhizomes. Yeah, so this is kind of the human scaffolding, which allows protocols to be replicated before we have like full holochain, which will allow peer-to-peer protocol replication in software, with each app acting as one game or one set of rules, which are executed to spec. Yeah, I've also been developing peer-to-peer canvassing, which is based on check-ins and a peer-to-peer canvassing ethic about how you collect data and share data, how you replicate your canvassing projects to other potential canvassers. I used to be a canvasser briefly. Yeah. It's not a cult, it's a cult. It's an Airbnb for communal experiences. So, yeah, this is not about holochain, this is about, I think, Khalil's idea here. You had an idea for that. But yeah, so the next part after weird and viral marketing is neo-digital outreach. This is actually, I'm just launching this project. So coming from the retreat, I'm going to be traveling to different activist communities and also different interesting research locations and networking these hackerspaces together, networking these communities together, figuring out what their needs are for holochain apps. Like you're trying to do some activist project, what do you need to actually succeed at that? How could we put it into software? How could we help you skip steps in your movement by moving ahead to software? Yeah, get them a holoport, get them training for how to program holochain, and connecting them with resources. So trying to accelerate activism in general. Hackerspace replication, so full stack replication of all of the good things or resources or capabilities in one place, formalizing those as protocols of how to replicate those things, and then putting those protocols out and those resources out in a way that can be accessed and replicated by other locations. Yeah, networking different spaces together. And there's a really key question here, how to form an economic unit that treats its members ethically. No one has solved this problem yet. I've never met a space that's like owned by its community members and treats everyone ethically and is like bottom line stable over a long period of time. And I might add a fourth and there of doing this using like an open source user interface, which is very convenient. I'm gonna take this off. So yeah, we maybe have this in a centralized way where there's like a board of directors and that kind of thing, but I've never seen a fully functioning, stable community of this sort that's run using decentralized technology and paradigms. Maybe Quakers, or something like that. Meaningful gamification, so mass public gaming, yeah, holochain apps can enforce the game rules, games plug together into a shared mythic universe. And there's a really great example of this happening right now with Marvel's Infinity Wars, which I haven't seen yet. And it takes, like 10 different movies and builds them into a huge mythos that also is in the same world as TV shows such as Marvel's Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., which is awesome, and you should watch it. And it's onboarding to this project by Joss Whedon. And so, similarly, what if a mythos that huge was collaboratively constructed by the public? What if every job had a mythic version of that job on like a different ID card? So programmers with wizards or something like that, and all these different jobs. So here's an example of the app's pipeline. This is online at map.holohackers.org, and this is a map of, this is a little outdated, I need to update it, but this is a map of all of the app ideas I've collected. And they are stratified according to holographic department, which is the color, and then kind of a rough time priority going this way. So in general, I want to keep collecting all of the labor that would prevent us from being already at post-capitalism into this one kind of system. And then everyone can collectively prioritize, draw new divisions, rename the boxes, and collectively reduce the time it takes to get to post-capitalism, materially as well as ideologically. So yeah, apps pipeline, this is Holo's, we're calling it the incubator, and it's going to kind of construct a commons engine that will help people to replicate Holo's success in its ICO and its crowdfunding and its building of apps. So after we build our flagship app and a couple other apps, we're going to open source Holo's code. Holochain is open source. Holo is source included, but legally restricted for a brief amount of time because we want to help people replicate good quality code. We don't want shitcoins at the beginning. So we're going to be actively helping people to replicate Holo as soon as it's mature. Yeah, there's no time to explain. So Xenogaming Industries, Xenogaming as a kind of reified entity where we're able to start articulating the protocols on which Xenogaming runs. If there was this huge game that we're already playing, what are the rules that we're already not seeing? Our algorithms are already operative. So yeah, Xenogaming Industries is a distributed alternative reality corporation. It exists in the future, and it has hired agents in the past to work for it. And if you don't do what Xenogaming Industries tells you, then what's the next slide? Vision statement. Xenogaming Industries is creating an era of mass public gaming, resulting in the breakdown of capitalist subjectivity and the production of post-capitalist subjectivities and modes of living. Xenogaming Industries is committed to offering an escape hatch from capitalism into a labyrinth of transfinite portals. She's a pro Xenogamer. I'm keeping this short so we can do questions and have more of a discussion. But yeah, legalize Xenogaming. We're not loitering. We're playing Pokemon Go. So like once you have an app base, you go to level 5 to enter my gym. Like once you have a user base on your applications, you can start to protect your users. If we have a bunch of games where people are being weird in public, we can then say, stop arresting our users because they're just playing this game, and if you look at their phone, you'll see that that is in fact the case. See? The Pokemon were around us the whole time, we just now have the technology to see them. So the year is 2028. Pokemon Go has rid the world of obesity. Everyone knows everyone in their neighborhoods. Loneliness is an archaic concept. All national borders have been erased, so players can search for Pokemon unrestricted. There is no war, there is no suffering. The planet is finally at peace. So this is the promise of Xenogaming, and now I want to go into try to get into the mind space a little bit more. That was all pretty practical and fairly grounded for me. So now we'll try and get into the mind space more of working with the Dark Chain, which is a version of the Glass Speed game, which is a book by Herman Hesse. So this is from the movie In the Mouth of Madness. It's funny, isn't it? For years I thought I was making all this up, but they were telling me what to write, giving me the power to make it all real. And now it is. All those horrible, slimy things trying to get back in, they're all true. See the instrument of their homecoming. That instrument is theory fiction, which is a speculative praxis for developing convergent, eventually consistent metafictional technologies. CCRU, with especially Mark Fisher, Reza Negarestani, and Nick Land, developed the concept of theory fiction, especially in the book Cyclopedia by Reza Negarestani. So this technique of theory fiction often uses a double pincer technique, going back and forth between fiction or hyperfiction, where you're writing about, like often sci-fi, because you're writing these really abstract, detailed objects and plot lines and metaphors, and you go from the fiction to the theory, and then back to the fiction, and then back to the theory. So you extract the theory from the fiction, you elaborate and clarify the theory, and then you go back and see what changes would I need to make to the story to synchronize it with this new theory. And then you get new ideas, and you're like, oh, I could take the story in this direction. So we're farming our imagination to produce new theoretical insights. The new Bible that starts the change, helps you see, is the Dark Chain. And this, if Holo is making Holochain, Xeno or Xenogaming Industries would be making the Dark Chain. And this is not a computer technology. This is an imaginal or myth-making technology that functions in your collective unconscious and in your imagination. So, yeah, technically defined, the Dark Chain is the chain of ideas that lead to the next dominant paradigm. So at any given point, all these people are trying to come up with new speculative ideas that one of them might become the next dominant paradigm. And if that happens, the people who came up with that idea, their magic was real all along. And the people who came up with all the failed ideas are retroactively labeled charlatans. And they were all labeled charlatans on the way. And then some people, their idea turned out to be more productive or more effective and wins the next paradigm battle. So it's also, yeah, a systematic negentropic mining framework, so you can actually mine negentropy, which then brings in local events in the game that help to feed your machine. And then it's also a magic item discovery matrix. The post-capitalist subject is actually not a thing, so much as it is these hyperobjects, these huge objects that extend through the ideological space, and we can be just a small chunk of those huge objects because they're so big. So using the Dart chain, you can start to map out this subterranean topography of the collective unconscious rigorously. And I have a collection of magic objects in my backpack. It also gets you really high. Like when I discovered the Dart chain and started systematizing it, I was hospitalized. So, even you don't have a holographic money wallet that prints love money, just take a copy of mine. And this is a picture from Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. Season 4, and it's Holo logo on top of the Necronomicon, basically. So, yeah, this is like collective summoning. And what am I summoning? So, Holo-chan is what we're summoning. And Holo-chan, so whereas 4chan is based on anonymity, and so it has this amazing productive capacity, and it produces just an enormous amount of content because there are no consequences for overproducing or producing something that people don't like because it's anonymous. Holo-chan will be about filtering and concentrating and basting the memes in themselves. It's a different dynamic. So first, let me compare this with Pepe Cash. Pepe Cash is currently the closest thing we have to like a platform that could support xenogaming. This is basically a meme economy. It's ironic because they talk about rare Pepes, but in order to get a Pepe Cash card or meme on Pepe Cash, you have to go through all these rules, and it's really boring. And it's centralized. You have to submit your Pepe to the Rare Pepe approval board, and they will approve it as a rare Pepe, which is no longer rare because it's now on the blockchain where everyone can see it, but they can also see who owns it, like a CryptoKitty. So the idea, and it's a what's it called, deflationary currency because they burn half of it every week. So see what they're doing is the faster they play their game with the cards that have they have actually like the Magic the Gathering type cards, and I deleted them from the slideshow, but they have different rules, like if you have this card, your X coin are worth 2 times as much, and that kind of thing. So they have all these fun rules written on the cards, but the rules don't do anything. They're just in the collective imagination of the players. If we re-implemented Pepe Cash on Holochain, the rules on the cards could actually do things. And so we could trade rules. In quantum theory right now, they have a new term called magic, and it refers to the library of unique and difficult to reproduce quantum states that an agent has. So if you have kind of like a library of all different kinds of rule sets, you become capable of doing a lot of different types of actions in any given situation. So yeah, these are the rules for Pepe Cash. There's actually, this is a business proposal to make a Pepe Cash game, and it's going to be this enclosed board game designed by a central group of people or a small group of people, and it sounds so boring. Like, it is our intent to give almost all these trading cards a meaning, a software they can use so they don't just stand there, and how we're doing so is new. So it's like they're going to make this little box board game you can buy, but it's totally limited, it's totally finite, and it's totally a construction of a small group of people trying to build a singular mythology for a customer base. Meanwhile, we need something like a meme library or meme-brary, which would be more like what Holo-chan would be. And this ultimate meme library app, the Memetic Accelerator, it's a world currency where you trade memes until someone laughs, and that's the end of the transaction. Ideological navigation, the memes have this really interesting property where by pairing the image and the word, they embed a perspective into the image so that even though you might not know what perspective it is, you can see that there's something embedded semi-objectively in the image. Emoji economy. So yeah, if we had a perfect meme library app, which Holochain would be the perfect platform to build it on because it distributes the GUI as well as the application logic, then you have a distributed self-upgrading GUI, you have localized micro-sourcing, so this is not about anonymity of memes, it's about who has the best curation of memes and why, in which context. And you get built-in gematria, which creates interesting coincidences between different unrelated memes because of the language used to describe them, and you tag them, of course. So the thing is, Holo-chan already exists in the future, and we can access it now by constructing well-formed queries. I'm working on a Holo query language, which is a way for a decentralized ecosystem such as Holo is evolving into to query itself. So anyone could construct a Holo query, and it would go out and be forwarded to the right people who might respond to that query. And this is actually a way for us all to construct a collective subject together as we speak, if we understand Holo query language. So similarly, if you make queries to Slinky, the cat made entirely of honey, or Roko, of the Roko's basilisk, you can start to receive these bounties now as an employee of Xeno Gaming Industries. So here are a few memes, and then I'll take questions and discussion. Where is the Middle East headed? Into the Tellurian insurgency of the Earth towards Xenodrome. Yeah, this is Xenodrome is the post-Xeno Gaming Earth, where you have, you know, mass spontaneous musicals, people running around the streets dressed as everything, zombies. Like I'm creating a line of fashion with the Holo's director of marketing, Sammy Van Ness, called Business Cosplay Casual. Yeah, and it's going to be huge. And here's something that we're actually getting traction now on 4chan, which is really fun because I've been running HoloMeme. If you go to twitter.com/HoloMeme, I would scroll all the way to the beginning so you can see the progression. And now people are making memes. So like that project I feel like was kind of successful because it's taken off and other people are playing this game as well. And there's Arthur Brock, one of the co-founders in the photo. And yeah, here's the thread from that. Very comfy, don't bully Holo. Funniest thing I've seen all week, are you actually investing money into these SJWs, social justice warriors? Are these fucks not interested in making money? What the fuck is the purpose of this coin? I'm getting a bit nervous having put some money into this. I bought 150K, but I'm nervous now. So like, people on 4chan literally cannot understand that some currencies are not a scam. They're like, why isn't this working as a pump and dump? And it's because Holo fuel currency is asset backed by a cloud computer that's owned by the crowd, and the transaction fees are like, I think, 2 orders of magnitude smaller than other networks, and Holo has put itself into debt and is going to work its way out of debt. But anyway, the point is that your Holo fuel will actually be redeemable for useful services, basically cloud hosting, such as Google Drive. And so it's not going to crash in value because that stuff's not going to suddenly become useless. At least it may go down, still of course, but I think it's not going to crash.
It's also from 4chan.
Yeah, this is from 4chan too. So Mega FOMO penetrates every exchange and forces everyone to FOMO in, thus causing an extreme rise in the market cap. Undeniable persuasion. And so in my opinion, Holochain is the only kind of technology, could be Holochain or something similar, that can actually shift us away from blockchain-based currencies such as Bitcoin or Ethereum, because it would require a mass collective agreement to all shift our protocol. And the specific types of apps we're building on Holochain, self-governance and kind of like the ability to form discussions and do governance discussions around switching to a new fork, will allow user bases to create pull on their application developers, open source, and will create paid pipelines through that type of mechanism for open source application developers. And so eventually there will actually maybe be a big enough crowd that they could all decide together on a migration pathway away from a given currency. This is a similar question to how would we all decide as a human species to stop cutting down the rainforests? We don't actually have that decision-making capacity now, but we might soon. So yeah, there's more memes there at HoloMeme. And how you can help Xeno Gaming Industries. Yeah, so just to summarize the vision, I see this as, I'm trying to do this as Holo's gaming division, or like a separate company that would be like Holochain's mass activist gaming movement. And right now I'm doing this research project on this where I'm going to be visiting different activist communities, gathering information about this, and networking these communities together. Yeah, and functionally it works as massively viral advertising, because people will say, like, have you played the game? And you're like, which game? You're like, the game! Like, the game. And so then there'll be a new menagerie of mass public games and a coherent tech and mythic platform for piecing these things together so that every game is part of the whole, or most games at least, can become part of the whole if they're well-formed in a mythic context. So yeah, the help I need leads on researchers, communities, events, and games, project people, locations, organizations. I need people to help me improve and vet this concept. If you have awareness of similar concepts, or if you have expertise that you think would be helpful here, it would be great to talk with you. And right now, I'm probably being funded for some amount of time to do this research project, but I'm not totally sure yet. But in general, I want to design and author funding proposals, maybe white papers. Moritz and I are going to write a white paper on a distributed reality show called Onto Them, where we're going to onto-board celebrities into crypto culture. Yeah, so it'll be like kind of our decentralized Scientology, like brainwashing outreach. Yeah, and that's going to be really fun. We're writing it as documentarians who are waiting for the game to abduct us, because we're not making it, someone else is making it. Any questions?
Okay, I had to write this question down because it came at a key moment where you should some needs. All right, yeah, this question is about post-capitalist subjectivity. So I feel like leftist theory fiction in like the mid-20th century, maybe like Gramsci and Debord and stuff, auto-boarded everybody into capitalist subjectivity really well. Up until the point where now, like, for a lot of leftist thinkers, we're just in like bigger and bigger prisons. And I feel like post-capitalist subjectivity and this abundance mindset that you described is very hard for me personally to figure out how to experience. And I'm hoping you can tell us about the onboarding process.
That's a really interesting question. Let's see. Okay, so it is indeed hard to experience. And first, let me respond to the earlier part of your question. So, yeah, in terms of like from your point of view, like the timeline of like modern subjectivity, you've got the people you mentioned in the Descartes, Freud, and Jung, and Aleister Crowley, and like a bunch of people around the early 1900s that constructed this kind of sterile platform that we all are born into today, the matrix. And then, like through that, like Debord was probably already seeing post-capitalist subjectivity, but just helped to like solidify the current paradigm. For moving through and past this, there's kind of like a difficult truth here, and that is that this education, this modern platform of subjectivity, is actually unequally distributed. And it's actually pretty closely distributed with what we would call literacy, which I think is a really problematic term because it basically means, can you speak English, or can you read English? And also like one person judging another person's ability to do language is very problematic. So, like what is unequally distributed is this modern platform. And so if you are like a healthy, self-actualizing, or as Maslow said in his last book, transcendently self-actualizing adult, you have this modern platform, you're using it, you're going beyond it, and you're constructing new things with yourself in the as a modern subject, or you could say postmodern subject by that point. But if you have a partially constructed platform of modern subjectivity, you're a dysfunctional person. That's basically what that looks like. And most of us are dysfunctional in this world because most of us have trauma passed down from our parents. Some very privileged people, and I use that word neutrally, have parents who are rich or very wise, and they're able to purchase or give their children like a full loop of human subjectivity and bring them into like conscious adulthood. I study initiation and sapience, so like how to heal people's original human wisdom that is damaged by trauma. So basically, like as you heal your trauma and just keep working on that, then you will start to see larger and larger pieces, follow your obsessions, follow your passions, and put the pieces together. And there's a bunch of pieces in here, there's a bunch of pieces on my website, and I'm not trying to say that it's like only advanced people can see this or something, but what I am saying is that if you haven't seen it yet, how you do it is you start to put the pieces together. And I have in my backpack a box of index cards that are in 5 different colors, and that is a really good way to start brainstorming a ton of ideas. If anyone wants to talk with me online about this, I can give a lot more detailed step-by-step, but it's really hard to describe briefly. If someone else wants to ask another question, I'll talk more about that.
So, one of these horrible comments is a question, but it seems like very familiar to like when Jaron Lanier talks about like the idea of being able to be like paid for like the creative work that you do online and have some sort of like rewards and reputation systems.
Can you speak up a bit?
Oh, sorry. Like Jaron Lanier talking about like that you could rather than just having like purely advertising models online, that you're like creating content, like and those that are creating memes could be like rewarded through that either in some capacity. It seems like very much in that regard. You read that like you are not a gadget. So I was just curious, like if you were commenting on that.
Yeah, but what were the names you mentioned?
Jeremy Lemieux, he's like crazy dreadlocks. He's like one of the early VR guys. I was wondering if you're familiar with him and like that.
I'm not, unfortunately.
We are at Exosphere. We're also partnering with Holo and HoloChain, etc.
Right.
We're actually talking exactly about building a platform like this, where people are paid for the quality of the content that they contribute.
Okay.
Like a global informational commons space. We can talk more about that later if you want.
Yeah, there's a good paper like shifting. He has this like paper about moving from data, the data you generate online is like capital to labor. It'd be cool to but yeah.
But yeah, I am speaking to that, and HoloChain provides a lot of potentials for attaching business models to that idea. And yeah, this whole thing is about like how can we create a way of living, a way to make a living as an artist or as someone creating stuff. And then this raises the whole question of like, should I be paid similarly to someone farming for food? Who's actually like feeding people versus creating memes. It's a really problematic thing. I think we should put a lot of pressure on that question because it's really close to the core of should we feed everyone? And yes, we should. What was your question?
So I am like thinking, imagining this kind of like post-capitalist future where I'm playing the game. I'm really enjoying myself. So thank you for my sort of like premature onboarding process.
Thank you. They're coming for you.
Yeah, I'm well aware of this, right? But what I'm wondering is in this sort of like age of abundance where we're all playing this game together, what is, going back to the comment that you just made, what is my sort of incentive, assuming that I'm really good at making games, because I am, what's my incentive to sort of do anything else, right? If everyone's perception is similar to mine.
Well, as a psychologist, I've actually studied motivation quite a bit, intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. And the over-justification effect says that when you add extrinsic motivators to something that you are formally doing for the joy of it, it usurps the actual intrinsic motivation. It kills your internal joy, depending on how big the reinforcers are. So, so that's part of it, but let's see. Okay, so I think that being able to make memes for easy money is not at the core. Is part of the core maybe?
Easy is like work.
Sure,
right?
yeah, because then you have people competing on making the best memes in their local community. So, and I also want to emphasize it's not just about memes. This is about playing all kinds of different games and inventing new different kinds of games. So, jobs will become the same as games, and they'll have a myth attached to them. So, like you'll be able to travel the world as an X, and it could be like wizard, warrior, conjurer, like these different, we play punks, these different things. So jobs and game roles, I think, will become more and more fused. I don't think people are going to stop doing what they love in order to make memes just because it's a quick buck or something equivalent. And also, these things are all contextualized in the community. So.
Perhaps another way to look at that question or to look at what you're saying is that, if there might be a community of people who are producing the materials for other people to subsist, but that community could itself become more attractive because there's a new set of rules, myths, and interesting game elements attached to it, and that can become more important than like the subsistence activity in and of itself, just like any proto-religion.
Yeah, cognitive parts of the brain always take over. Like anytime this type of function develops, it takes over the scaffolding. Yeah.
You made a quick reference to finite infinite games in the presentation. I just want to see, where do you see that coming in here? Do you follow any of that stuff, any of the James Carr style?
A bit. I don't know much about James Carr specifically, but I've read Finite Infinite Games, and it's the author, right? Thank you. Yeah. And so yeah, I just read that one book by him, and also the whole HoloChain team has been exposed to those ideas now, which is great. And I see the game, the xenogaming, as the infinite game, like the one game.
That's where I was seeing like that.
Yeah. So how can we start to add a grammar and semantic engagement to infinite games that is intelligible as a finite game and an infinite game? And that's the camouflage.
Expanding on what you said, so the problem with capitalism is that it only achieves infinite game status by causing immense destruction.
that things have to, they go to a huge company and then it has to collapse. So you seem to have a chain of finite games. And the question is this chain of finite games, can it become an infinite game? I'm worried, how are you going to deal with people winning the game?
Interesting.
You can't win infinite games.
No, you can win an infinite game, you can win a finite game.
Yeah. So this is one of the more difficult and interesting game design problems, because really the game is about designing the game for others, designing onboarding systems and interesting adventures, like you get a letter in the mail and it says meet at this place, hide out in this bathroom for 3 hours, and then like someone will give you a secret message. And that message is invest in X, or something like that. So it's about creating these games for others, but designing a game is not really as fun as playing it sometimes, like being the game master all the time. So, so part of it is like once you complete a game, you often join the designers or helping to administer that game. And then another part of it is, yeah, you can't win the overall game. I'm not sure that the infinite game itself can be mechanized, but I'm working on that. So
I think if it could be mechanized, it wouldn't be an infinite game.
no, I think maybe it can be, and it would coincide with the discovery of true intelligence that can be mechanized. So I'm working on a concept called the holoxel, which is a holographic pixel. And when that concept finishes formalizing itself through me and other researchers, we will have also, that'll coincide with Scepter, which is what Holochain is supposed to evolve into. So we'll have grammatic capacities that can be spoken by a decentralized computer, and it might coincide with the ability to formalize an infinite game. I'm not totally sure, but I suspect that. I think you were first.
Well, yeah, kind of throw a couple of ideas and see if they sound like, I don't know what you're thinking of. Bernard Benj wrote Rainbow's End. Okay.
Right.
Anyway, near future, everyone sort of has these VR realities that and can choose what you, so everyone organizes into these vast communities which participate in this, in different VR experiences. So you basically choose one community or the other, and wherever you go, that's the sort of reality you see. This sounds kind of similar to what you're saying. And one of the blockchain-based idea I want to throw your way is meme markets by Simon de la Rouvière. I don't know if you're familiar with that. It's sort of like, again, you're trading memes. You buy into the idea of a meme, and so it can be a means of coordinating people. It's similarly trippy to me in that it's sort of economics that just sort of emerge out of memes themselves. I guess I'm just throwing these out because I'm just trying to understand what you're saying.
I need somebody honest.
And so I'm sort of fumbling my way there. So these sound like they're generally related, or you sort of see me combining both of these and doing all sorts of interesting things with them.
Yeah.
I just want to throw that out.
Yeah, and yeah, definitely Meet Marcus is here. And sorry, what was the first idea you talked about?
These sort of massive VR communities.
Oh, yes. Yeah, and that's there as well. With the VR communities, the difference is it would actually start with grassroots, very tiny games, which gradually coalesce into larger and larger myths. And then meme markets, you can see I was thinking about that definitely. In terms, so Dark Chain is actually the way that these small pieces gradually coalesce as larger myth. So it's not like someone designing like, oh, we need, a villain, we need a mythic world. It's actually discovering these pieces and how they're affordances for plugging together, which then suggest a mythic interpretation, such as malls and zombies, which were in the original, what was it called, Night of the Living Dead, or like how vampire myths so actually fit like vampiric capitalists, that kind of thing. These tend to fit retroactively the structures that we're looking at.
And there's today you want to also show the other stuff you wanted to.
Okay, let's see. Yeah, so there's also, should have shown this earlier because there's, yeah, there's also, if you want to learn more about this, I would start with reading my team briefing 2017. It was a 2-year research project, the Transliminal Earth Alliance Meta-Narrative, and it's a self-constructing decentralized activism movement. And this is at my website, andersamba.com. It's on the Ouvra page. And then there's also, this is the second paper I would read, Rex plus HoloChat, the ultimate chat paradigm. And this shows how like the kind of dynamics of HoloChan would create a fully flat, like hypercard-based labor economy, or a kind of a autonomous labor economy, where the labor becomes able to seek its best executor. And here are some links. We've got internetschoolofmagic.com, coalitionofinvisiblecolleges.org, which is a directory for different meta-organizations to link together. It's kind of just a prototype. Holo Meme, Twitter. I'm the admin of Sorcery of the Spectacle on Reddit. And there's a hidden page on my website, finder.php, which has an example of a decentralized organizer's binder. There's also holochain.org, our chat at chat.holochain.org. We also have a Telegram, and holo.host and scepter.org, which is what Holochain is intended to evolve into. And there's some videos on my YouTube, which I don't have time for, and this is the last one. So yeah, I'll take one or two more questions. I think you were first in the back.
Oh, no, I
So previously in sort of past prior career, I was playing a very zero-sum game that was very much oriented around like extrinsic rewards, and there was a lot of mimicry. It was very much like very capitalist. So now, like thinking about this kind of future world of abundance, where where we have these like shared mythologies with other people, that just seems really fun. Is that, and it seems much more grounded in like this enjoyable shared experience. Am I on the right track of like what I'm imagining this world looks like? Is this?
I think so. More fun than the mimicry.
Yeah. It sounds way more fun.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, and the key turning point will be when these stories switch from like playing Harry Potter in the neighborhood to like hacking things and then also calling yourself a wizard. So like when we can reify these mythic roles as real life roles is when we can bring magic back into the world for the public. And that is the point that I call the kitten wars, when we start to have weird public cultural battle over these definitions. I think you were first.
Please correct me if I'm misrepresenting your views. But it seems to me that at least part of what you're getting at is that in order for humans to have any meaning in post-capitalist world, it needs to be one that we invent, which seems to suggest that once we have abundance, like that won't be enough for us. Like we'll need something else to give our lives meaning. Like reality will no longer be meaningful enough. It seems like, for one, I would strongly go against the idea that simulated reality is not enough for people. And then two, I can see huge strife if two groups myth-making go against each other. Like this is, I mean, I don't want to call it a religious war, but if two people have entirely diametric, belief systems that they create around because they need a belief system to create because the world isn't enough for them, which I mean, I guess isn't too crazy of an idea because people have created plenty of myths because reality isn't enough for them.
Yeah.
But I mean, I see lots of strife.
Like the Sunnis and the Shias, right? The Muslims, right? They are based on a concept that one believes that the cousin was supposed to take over Islam, and the other believes that nephew was supposed to take over Islam, and they're both at each other's throats. So just to follow up on that, is it fractal imposterism? Is it being an imposter to an original concept, and then taking that concept and being an imposter to that original imposter, right? And then just infinitely doing imposters of imposters. Is that how you sustain holochain?
That might be a way to look at it. I'd have to talk more about this idea of fractal imposterism.
How do you prevent religious war?
Yeah. Okay. So. Yeah.
We're gonna solve it today, folks. We're gonna solve it today.
Okay. So. First of all, I think that yes, a lack of meaning in life is a real existential threat, and this is why people get so absorbed in things like Netflix and fantasy world and all of these things. Some people to escape, they don't have enough, and some people, once they have enough, to escape the boredom that they don't have any meaningful actions. So like action and meaning, I think, are closely related, and creating meaningful actions. And then, what was the second half of your question? I always forget the other half.
Two people. So if we decide that we're going to create a world for ourselves, to give ourselves meaning, and people's worldviews that they accept are different.
Cool. Okay, so yeah, so actually this is something that I think if there's like one thing that's like genuinely new or special that's coming out of this whole movement, it's that it's eventually consistent myth-making. So the whole thing is about contagion and counter-contagion, and if you're trying to mimic something or simulate something, you end up taking it in and creating rhizomatic connections that create massive spread and contagion of ideas. And part of the trick here is doing it without homogenization. But I think that these types of holy wars are actually going to become less and less common as it becomes more inescapable to also know your opponent's point of view.
Just a quick interjection. So the people who do want to take a break, feel free to do that. We are already quarter past. So, but we can still continue to make questions.
So it's inconsequential holy wars. Sorry? So
it's kind of flame wars online.
Yeah, I mean, so it's interesting, right? If the Sunnis and the Shias did fight and one, that's an example of a finite game. And one, all the Shias were annihilated. And you had only Sunnis. The next preceding game would be like a resurrection game. Yeah. Is that kind of like
but they fight in physical space. Like
they fight in the physical,
digital, like information space.
So this is inconsequential holy wars.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I think
do this first. If you haven't.
So I'm just struck by you're intending to create games for the sake of seeking meaning, but is there actually a pro-social agenda in terms of physical space? A lot of capitalism, for all its problems, still achieves social value in the process of destruction. Simply playing games simply burns energy.
Yeah, so this is a fantastic question. Yeah, and absolutely, I have an explicit, I'm not going to try and like put out my activist agenda for everyone, but I personally have explicit things I want to do in activism. Holo, I'm actually kind of trying to form Xeno and Holo as like two things that are intricately mapped. So I want to have kind of a mythic component to different types of activism, and then create those ties more and more strongly. For me, it's explicitly trying to help people, and the manner in which it helps people is replicating abundance. And so I see this as Holo Salesforce. Once we actually have Holo Chain and like kind of a Holo marketplace of some kind, like something like Amazon, except to be a bunch of little Amazons put together in one interface, then if you have like a small kickback for people who install this on someone's new computer or do that, like all that money that corporations are siphoning off for their profits gets to go to the people who are spreading this to the edges, and those are the gamers, those are the deckers who have their decks of interesting games and upgrades who invite you to weird parties.
Yeah, so that sounds beautiful. I mean, it's exciting. I would to dig deeper on the sort of the worldview issue. So we talked about like sort of like the Sunni and Shia. I mean, another concrete example where memes played out in terms of diametric worlds was like the recent U.S. election. You know, and that was one where, I mean, I think you could potentially make a case that there's like an optimistic narrative there. But there's a lot of people who would say that that's a very negative experience in like the American story. So I was just like curious to your thoughts there, because it seems like, I mean, that's where people are creating memes, and there are consequences to like people having different worldviews and like throwing them at each other in ways that wasn't possible before, and being connected as we are today.
Yeah, I agree. The Trump story is extremely dichotomous, and you can interpret it as the easy way, which is super abysmal, horrible American politics that has never been this bad, or you can interpret it like the 4chan way, which is anonymous as, what's it called, graded, filled. There's a third word that's better. When you overfill polls, like the 4chan rated the Time Magazine Person of the Year poll, and they got Moot, the creator of 4chan, as the #1 on the slot from voting. But Time Magazine was smart enough to redo its poll when they did that. But when the anonymous movement trolled the U.S. election and got a fake candidate into the office, the U.S. government did not have the security measures in place to prevent this type of hacking of its system. So basically, in my point of view, or like the weird point of view, the non-mainstream point of view, 4chan has, or Anonymous rather, has like taken over the United States effectively. And that could be seen as something positive. But in the short term, obviously, quite negative for a lot of people.
So, would this just enable more of that? Would this kind of holochain, would that just enable more of this?
Yes, but in a highly coordinated fashion. Like the reason we got stuck with someone like Trump is that there's not actually a decision-making mechanism to choose a good candidate that exists. But with Holochain, we can start to build alternative, really complex, rich tools for reputation and for choosing candidacy, or with, it could be with other platforms too. But to actually create these tools to make the collective intelligence more expressive in what it can express, then I think that people will use those tools to do more complex things than Donald Trump. Maybe one or two more questions? I think there was one over here. Nope. Okay, cool. Thank you so much. I'd love to talk with anyone interested in this.
What a great new world. I am incredibly interested. I was into this thing like magic and stuff. Oh my gosh, I'm so involved. But it's kind of your question. Like I was like, there's going to be a lot of belief systems that are exposed.
Yeah, so one, I said I don't necessarily think that that it's necessary for us to create an alternative to give us meaning in our lives. And then two, if we do need that, then like it's more than likely that not all of our needs are going to like I guess assuming that everybody is not college. Yeah, I would like to find strategies.
We're talking about eventually this myth thinking. There's a myth that was supposed to be one thing.
Also, overlaid with kind of like Western that allow us to like basically coordinate post-capitalist
kind of divergence. Playing games with this is actually great. That's how this is if this does it would be able to rectify.
So I'm like, let's go, let's get Jesus out there.
We all gotta get the bus. I don't think it will actually happen. I'm just gonna make that out. I just got
Hey, are you supposed to be giving a talk right now?
I did it when you said
oh, okay.
Yeah. But no, if you've ever done cosplay,
because I'm worried about being an old curmudgeon because I really like to play games.
Right.
I'm gonna be left behind.
But maybe
I don't really like to put on.
You would be the normie game. You would normie. The
normcore.
You're actually explaining to me. We had this discussion.
I'll play normcore.
I mean, once we're in the post-capitalist world, like, what the fuck are you going to do all day? Suddenly, the games might start to look appealing. Dude, I'm into this. I'm into these ideas right now.
Have you seen Have you seen how
No, like I briefly went on the dude's website when I was looking them up, and I was mostly turned off.
Yeah.
Oh, dreamy. Huh?
You went to what?
Oh, I said I originally went to a website. I was kind of turned off, like language is a joke too, so I wasn't quite sure like how much was meant for, how much was serious. Like I went to
how much was like word games?
That's the thing, like,
I didn't see the getting started
it's the exact example. It's exactly the kind of problem that 4chan has to solve this kind of thing because there's exclusionary.
Well, I feel like your whole deal is like exclusionary to anyone that doesn't want to share into your mythos. So like you have to.
No, but you can discover anything you do will exclude somebody like by just making any kind of choice.
I feel like you guys, so coming from the outside, just looking at your website, or not your website, but his website, School of Science or whatever.
Like that's because Apple auto-boarded us onto their design kind of ontology.
It seems like you're trying to be obtuse. And in a certain sense, I think you are trying to be obtuse. You're trying to create your own mythology, your own world. But like to indoctrinate someone, I guess that's your whole onboarding thing. But like to get someone from this reality to the next is like. It's a big. There's a lot of friction there. Like there's a lot of friction. No, but you want converts.
I don't care if somebody wants to, or like I don't care if it's doing what I want to do with that. So what people feel like that's something else to join. That's weird. Make space for it.
So like just going on your website, I didn't really understand that. Like I didn't have the understanding that I have now, and I don't think I would have just from going on your website. After this talk, I'm super interested. Right now, I'm super interested.
I'm a website designer, and the website is not good enough yet. I totally agree, and we have lots of problems explaining exactly what it's about. But that's partially also just the sheer complexity of what it is. Right? Like just the architectural thing, especially even for blockchains. Even for blockchains, who come from the blockchain world, it's for them more difficult to get this than people who have not even heard of blockchain. Because they have a certain idea in their mind of what it means to do crypto technology, what it means to be decentralized. And so when they're getting all their assumptions invalidated with this new thing, like they have a hard time like seeing, is this real? Is this fake? Is this exit scam? Like, 4chan actually right now is like both laughing their ass off as well as getting really frustrated with trying to like dump the shitcoin, they say, but it's not working because people do know the full extent of what it's about. They're holding on to it like for real. They're not willing to sell for anything. So it's like, I feel like it's in the same magnitude of the Bitcoin kind of singularity that happened when like Bitcoin, wow, now you can do money online. If you think of what money is a subset of a larger category, which is currency. Right? Currency is a much broader category.
Social currency,
the people,
reputation currency.
Yeah, like for example, your college degree, if you have one, is reputation currency. You can't trade, right? But how do you get your college degree? By going to university, by getting credits, which are supposed to be a time metric.
It sort of transfers their reputation to you.
Right,
College
exactly. I mean,
reputation
basically college uses a combination of grades, which are a performance metric, with credits, which are a time metric, to structure the flow of education throughout the entire student body, such that at the end, hopefully, you get educated students, because that's the goal, right? Of course, you could disagree about the effectiveness of that, and like being settled down with debt at the end of it, not taking risks in the years where you're supposed to be taking risks, all that kind of stuff, but still, like that's the idea behind it.
But based on that mechanism, wherein you want outcomes, what is the desirable outcomes? Is it that everybody needs to have their own meaning and constructing their own meaning?
This is like, I'm not making any assumption about what other people want. I'm just saying like what I care about, and then
but it's creating a platform.
Yeah, I can talk to you about that and what you care about. Yeah, but I can't tell you what you should care about.
Sure. But it's giving
there's like design decisions, right, in terms of how the platform.
Yeah, so comes from like they have very idea of what currency is. So they always have this kind of currency. It's something that allows you to see currency. So flows, information, value.
Yeah.
So basically, the whole chain doesn't have a currency layer, but allows you to build all kinds of currencies that fulfill different functions, what everyone can do in your community, that don't have to be money based, right? For example, the way that you do a currency in the whole paradigm most effectively is through mutual credit. You know how that works? You know how in the company you have credit, or like double entry accounting basically? That's exactly how it works. For one person to have a positive, you have somebody else has to have a negative person. And so it's more doing crypto for contributors to something, and therefore it's more value than it's taken out. That's part of you can go into your the thing is, like, blockchain, there's no monolithic platform. Like, everybody goes onto that and has to make use of a shared resource. All the blockchain is shared, right? If you want to do any kind of smart contract thing on Ethereum, you're paying for access. The shared computational resources is global memory of computers, right? Because it's a scarce thing. Because you have to guard the access, you're trying to make a whole trust context happen for everybody, getting all the data from all the IoT on the blockchain. Where blockchain is building an application, and the communication and the interaction happens exclusively between the local devices and like that. And so everybody actually writes their data to their own chain, their own device first, and everything that other people look up or are part of a shared space with you as well, that gets distributed to them through a system. And so it's just very like, sort of a data-centric paradigm where like you have the data in the middle and everybody else has edges. You have an agent-centric paradigm where I have ownership of my own data, I'm like sovereign over that, and I'm giving it out to people who need it for other purposes.
So how is this different from Blockstack, right? Where the Blockstack is basically putting identity on the blockchain. So
yeah, but blockchain paradigm, so it's one blockchain, right?
No, they're blockchain agnostic, so they can switch.
They're still using blockchain, like fully shared spaces, not like individual chains, right?
Yeah.
So like every single app
they are.
Yeah, like for example, if you and I are on Slack, when I send a message to you, it's just reminding you. So they have this everything is you just have to
Extending the break for like 10 minutes.
So how many people use this?
But talking about the social impact, this is actually part of several larger technology projects, which is basically to get computing to get biological patterns scaled to depositions. That's like think about your body, right? It's like you have cells in every organ, and there's no like complete, there's no one state of the system. Right? Like your cells pay attention to the stuff around them. And communicate with them through shared protocols, right? Blood, all these that's how they communicate, but then they go into organs. So
have you actively mimicked biological systems creating
and it comes from the biomimicry. Okay.
So what is the
I don't know what it is. Probably something to do with acceleration. I'm not actually as on board into this field as he is. Like he's been doing this magic on me for like 4 months now. So I have a easier time explaining some of this stuff, but still, I'm not from his small mind space. I mean, this is the thing. Once he has learned, like, you know what he did? He basically downloaded another mind virus. It complex it, that they have a hard time even formulating severe questions. There's so much energy that's going in, or rather, weirdly structured negative copy. That you don't know what the pattern is.
What are you talking about? That sounds like
It'll be. I'm not there's no book that I'll tell you somebody I'm just talking about like what I'm what he's doing. I have a hard time explaining what he's doing.
Okay.
No, yeah. I don't wear
you don't want to say. But is it like we all there, we all
talk?
I mean, this is the one that's
yeah, they need
we're still trying to figure out what
everyone's confused. Basically, we're trying to make the open window challenge.
You guys are probably doing the best and everyone's.
This was the, what, there's actually magic happening and technologies enabling us to see the magic?
I don't think there's such about like alternate realities, alternate realities, like gamify actors like
if you don't finish though, I think you pay it bridges.
I mean, I can see what you're saying. No, because like, think about...
That's the game though.
Yeah, we're all frying our brains.
It's almost like we
think about like the online chat room, right?
It's about making this patterns everywhere. And so you count these like patterns.
Excuse me, can I have your attention just for a sec? I just want you guys to know that Jeremy Welsh, who is slated to be in the Blueberry room, is not here. So we've moved Nolan Gray, who is in the Watermelon room. He's not here. He'll let you know what his session's about, or there's also the main room is still on as well.
Okay.
My session is going to be about the ephemeral nature of music as it correlates to emotion and how that emotion translates into value in terms of blockchain. So, in a nutshell.
We'll get started in just a few minutes.
Yeah, it was definitely.
I feel like we're both here.
Where are you going now?
Yeah.
There's a lot of pieces to it as far as mythologies, how do we create frameworks of justifying our existence is kind of very how do we tie those myths as a game, as we're a character in a game that we play, and encourage people to invent games, invent myths for themselves, but have all this be a part of one big game. They sort of had the priest prophecy. This is how it's going
oddly structured, kind of tried to bring filling the fried vessel with I think it's
there's lots to be afraid of. There's tools called these are very powerful psychological.
Yeah, I think
I'm afraid.
I want to look at how it works.
He certainly has a bigger vision for blockchain and the rest of
We got a lot of
but I like the theme I said over and over. There's game is a neat framework. And like we're already using it. We're talking about you have credits,
well, it's also like
great formal countries.
get your
but then say, okay, we're going to space claims and memes, and like, where are we
Did you turn on the camera?
Oh, you want me to?
Yeah, she's the one that doesn't want to be streamed.
Okay, I can just pause live.
Okay.
So that should, I'll confirm it.
It's pretty simple. Yeah, I think about it a lot. Yeah, just like
Hey guys, Nolan Gray, and just want to say thank you so much for having me here. So glad to see all of you in real space. This is awesome, super exciting, and what I'm going to be talking about today is something that I think we're all interested in, which is the less visible, hidden, or occult systems and where those things manifest. Particularly, I'm interested in music and emotion, and how music and emotion work together to create value. Emotion is at the intersection between the disembodiment of value from the market, seen in the rise of cryptocurrency, and also music's divestment from its physicality and playback and distribution mediums. How these two are interrelated, I believe that we can see more about our identities where those two things overlap. So, I've been at the intersection of music and technology for the last 20 years as a DJ, producer, artist, and musician. I've seen the rise and fall and eventual containment of music. Much like skate parks, if you guys skateboarded, cities were very happy to put skate parks in because they could contain all of the energy that came along with skateboarding, and they knew where the people were, and so they used that as sort of a form of cooling skateboarding. And music was very similar. It got turned into an emotional utility, sort of a light switch for how you wanted to feel. You just open up Spotify and determine your set and setting. And I think that that was one of the processes that cooled music. But one of the things I've learned over all this time that I've come to believe about music is that it's using us. That it's a technology that's feeding back into us to influence our behavior and to build our communities. Next to CryptoKitties and online gaming skins, I think the value of music is really, really high as far as an ephemeral system goes. Because it's seen as like a 99-cent store product at this point, as a commodity, we don't think of it as valuable, but it has the power to make us cry and to make us elated, make us happy, and I think that's really important. So I think it's this emotional hook that keeps us returning to music, and I think it's something that you can all live without. We all don't eat music, and we don't breathe music, and we don't live music, and yet it's something that we just can't get rid of. So I think as St. Timothy Leary said, DNA is providing us this gift. Music is a gift to humanity from our DNA. And I think that that's really true. It's in this substructure that I see a connection with the blockchain and technology in general. Those two things in plants, of course, because plants have been really important in our evolution and in the evolution of our technology. And if you guys have dug into that at all, you can see that the history of how our brains have grown and how our muscles have grown and how our societies have grown have all been related to plants. And they're finding now that, like in the Journal of Human Evolution, that there is a case for plants influencing our evolution. So I think that's really cool because it's an asymmetrical power structure that's less asymmetrical than we thought it was. We thought it was about agriculture and that we were in control of all of these systems, but in fact those systems were relying on us for their propagation. So music has similarly relied on our biology to respond to its construction and to produce emotional effects that result in the passing along of those music pieces to another host. It perpetuates itself through these genres, and it excites other humans to contribute to those genres and form into new musical genres, new instruments, new pieces of technology, and it encourages us to develop
technologies to share those things. So the internet has been really powerful at sharing that information and creating value for it. So let's see here. Yeah, very important. So that's the basic foundation of what I'm looking at, what I care about. Music, I think, is just a really important, like warrant canary in the coal mine. It's something that we can see its cycles rise and fall and apply those cycles to a lot of other systems. Music is usually at the cutting edge of culture, and what I've seen is a cooling of that cultural, musical diversity, that it's not as big as it once was, that the revolution doesn't really have a soundtrack right now, the way that it did in the 60s, and the way that people are identifying themselves is becoming a lot more diffuse. So, as I like to say, you know, the algorithm on Spotify, all roads lead to Elton John, essentially, that no one is gonna thumbs down Elton John. And I think in this way, like, music has broken itself. But either that or it's aged like a fruit tree that no longer produces fruit, that it's just something that we love as a technology but doesn't really have the impact that it once had. It's either been greed that's killed it, or it's just died on its own and been buried by really bad search engines, because if you've ever used SoundCloud to try to find something specifically, you're going to be pretty frustrated. So those algorithms have failed to help us develop new mutations in music. The individual identity that genres provided allowed tribes to form and form positive mutations that occurred. These mutations have been subsumed by the mainstream in so many ways. So like as the blockchain has grown and everyone's excited about it and everyone's coming up with ideas and bouncing new things off of each other, these mutations are forming into little corporations and everyone's working together to push them out. And music was very much the same way. And what happened is that as it became more and more popular, they were able to package it into larger and larger corporations or mainstream events. And those things became monotonality. It's a very similar frequency of resonance that you're going to get when you go to a big box corporate festival, for example, versus like South by Southwest, which has a lot of like individual diversity happening and a lot of people interacting to create new musical mutations. I think this is the same danger that faces the blockchain, that it's going to homogenize in a way that we want to avoid as much as possible. That right now there's heat in the system, and the way to avoid homogenization of the blockchain is to build and reinforce networks that encourage diversity of emotional tonality. So I think it's really important that as we're developing products for the blockchain, that we're listening to the way that these products make us feel. Because there's a feedback loop that happens in music when you produce something that is in the right note or in the right key, and that it feels good, and there's a breath that happens. And you can communicate that, and people get excited about it, and it reinforces itself, and that's what causes people to pass it along. So I really like the idea that things like that are happening here at Refactor Camp. And I believe in the future that we'll be able to find connections in the chain between people with similar interests and form similar bonds, regardless of distance, and not just for advertising purposes. I think that's an important part of it. Eventually uniting all of the entities on the sphere for different reasons. They all happen to like music. I think that's a pretty common goal. And I think it's important to remember to look at and observe the technologies right now and how they make us feel about ourselves and how we bake those technologies. So Facebook, for example, was created to segregate a campus into hot or not. And that's the type of thing that's still baked into that technology and will forever be baked into that technology. And it has a specific resonance. And I think what we're seeing right now is that that resonance is no longer appealing. It's cooling because we now understand it as something that was preying upon our emotions. So like the blockchain, I feel like it's a very ephemeral emotional value. People get excited about the unseen opportunities, and ICOs are just the dollar sign that nobody's going to thumbs down. It's really something that's, I guess, ICOs are the Elton John of the technology. It's just a simple thing that everyone can agree is
probably going to be valuable in a way, but then nobody knows whether it's valuable and you're not going to thumbs down it, so you're just going to take the risk and that'll be that. But I think if we continue minting the same dumb thing over and over in a monotonal way, the heat will dissipate, the value will drop, and opportunity will be lost. And I really don't want the blockchain to be used to count beans and burritos at Taco Bell, because I don't think that's the history that beans deserve. I mean, to eke out profits in the thousands by using like a really accurate ledger system, probably not the best use of that technology. So in that criticism, I think that we need to build new application genres, just like musical genres. I think like an ICO is one genre. I think everyone in this room understands that there are a lot of opportunities that happen that have to come from the creative side of things. So one of those things I like to see is to incentivize sharing of our ideas. And I think that we can do that on the back of music. We're already sharing music. We love sharing music. We love saying like, hey, check this thing out you haven't heard before. If we can then piggyback the way that music is using us and get music to piggyback onto the blockchain, we'll be able to distribute the blockchain without having to distribute the blockchain on its own, if that makes sense. So we'll pull the hype out of it, we'll apply it to the transmission vector of music that's already working, and we'll be able to distribute it in a way that's very organic. I think that once we start using quantum computing to infer complex data nexuses, I think that we're going to produce unknown rifts in space that we don't understand yet. I think that the recurrent neural network is crystalline in structure of overlaying multiple blockchains will begin to vibrate. And as long as we keep putting energy into that vibratory system, just like a string in an instrument, it could cymatically pop into another state of existence. And we don't know what that looks like. We don't know if it'll be a gateway, and we don't know if it'll be another dimension, allowing like the Lemurians to bring enlightenment back to the Earth, if you want to get weird, or if it'll be some sort of interdimensional Elton John gremlin that comes through and blandifies all of human culture retroactively. We don't know what that ends up looking like. Although I think the current branding campaign for Best Western Hotel is pretty awful. So I don't know if it's a toothpaste store or a pharmaceutical company or a hotel. But I think that the identity of these things is really important. And that brings me back to our identities. So these blockchains reside on the concept of identifying a singular string of numbers. For now, this can be anonymous. But if identity were to be attached to a single string, then what I'm calling the lock chain can't be broken. And it's a legitimate digital fingerprint. It's as incorruptible as your DNA. The problem is that who I am today, I may not want to be tomorrow. And I think that applies to musical genres. You may find something that you don't like anymore, that you don't want to listen to Elton John anymore. You've had enough. You've had enough Beatles. You've had enough, I can't say Bowie, because you can never have enough Bowie, right? But say you change. And I think that you, in changing your identity, being as challenging as like changing your DNA will be impossible. So like we've seen the real name initiatives of Facebook and Google pretty much fail to actually help us be more transparent with who we are and how we treat each other and so forth. So I think the freedom of having the ability to test and change our minds is what's really important to this whole creative endeavor. And yeah, I think that becomes sort of an experience where you're looking at the compression of experience. You're trying to unpack your belief systems by uncompressing your experiences, which means having the right to change your mind. New information comes in, you want to change your mind. That becomes the metric for what I think is a new kind of state, like where you just have that freedom to do that thing. And so it's thinking of these things, of freedom as the ability to choose how the world sees us. And the recent push for equality is a push that should extend through our society in the pursuit of happiness, unimpeded by state's demand for a specific unchanging identity. Although identity becomes a privacy issue, we can see that it's really hard to tax offshore identities. So can I make my identity as zero knowledge proof? I think so. If you look at your driver's license and it says blue eyes, like your blue eyes metric could be blue eyes for anyone in the world, just returning a yes or no anonymously for you, which is, I think, what Zcash is doing. So a singular layer identity may not be what future generations want. and to build that into applications now so that our children won't be waging wars against servers, housed in disused prisons, attempting to free their identities from years of online shopping. Because when it's worth more to house servers than it is prisoners, we will probably move our data centers into prisons, or they'll be prisonized. So the way I'm thinking about building this, again, is on the back of music sharing. That you can swarm an ID comprised of tiny bits from other people's IDs that compose a whole and yet are untraceable by looking at the individual parts. This is already happening with music sharing as we get around DRM, and I propose that it's applied to identity. So in that way, we've merged almost identity, and everyone's identity becomes part of that blockchain, like whatever your hair color, blue eyes, metric, though it's de-individualized, it's now unified on a whole grander scale. And I want this because I want access to the opportunity to experience the emotion of each identity and to have the freedom to decide who I am in new and creative ways. I want my meat space suit to be upgraded with software from other dimensions that we just haven't contacted yet. I think that that could be one of those things that is valuable to the future, to my children. I want these identities to form communities of entities that share compressions without limiting each other from building complex experiences. So let's row the spacecraft forward. Focusing on the grains of sand that are our beliefs is keeping us from seeing the cosmic gorillas that we could become. So as we move forward, building crystalline applications on encrypted ledgers, let's keep the future us in mind and make sure that we're building platforms that reduce the compression of emotional experiences and enhance the opportunity for future generations to see themselves differently without having to fight wars for the freedom to be who they want to be. Let's listen to and create music that encourages and inspires us to feel new ways, because it's these feelings that form ephemeral value systems that inform how we see ourselves. Thank you.
There's some time for some questions, so maybe does anyone have, kick us off? Yeah.
I would love if you could expand a little bit more about what you were getting to on identities and how do we mix identities. I have multiple identities online.
Yeah.
But where does music come into that, sharing music?
Well, we generally identify ourselves through communities, and how we see ourselves is becoming more and more about the communities that we interact with. A good example of that is you could have a crazy idea and then do a Google search for it, and whether it's true or not, the information that you parse could become supporting evidence for that idea. And then you'd find other people who feel the same way, and then you've got an entire community of people who are seeing themselves in a specific sort of light. And that's happened with music forever, like punk rock, like every genre, hip hop, everyone has an identity that's generally then tied to genre.
Yeah. So I love you talk about how things get cooled. So the skateboarding got cooled by skate parks.
Right.
And you talked about the cooling of music. So we're kind of in this state now where music seems to be cooled by these kind of stuff. Do you think? I guess two questions. One is this is this sort of like a kind of general law of thermodynamics, where the heat is will eventually be cooled, and is that inevitable, or is that something we should fight against? What do you think about
Yes,
that?
I do think that it's a property of thermodynamics, but I think that it can be avoided by putting more energy into the system. So, I look at a lot of careers that are on the decline, and wonder why they were amazing at one point in time and then what caused the decline. So I just kind of collected these over time, and a lot of it comes down to, technical contracts and all this stuff, and how the money is allocated. And money, just like in the first presentation, is the fuel for the engine. So money is the thing that gets put in to offset thermodynamics and the cooling of any one of these things. So, skateboarding, for example, I think reached its apex with the X Games. The X Games was as big of a spectacle as it could be, though it could go to the Olympics, I think, as one step further. But I think that it's cooling just because there isn't as much energy going into the system. And so music's a similar way. You have a lot of careers that were created at a time when there was a lot of energy being put into them, and no longer is that the case. And as an independent artist, you need to really have a business plan, be a business person to know how to put energy into your system to avoid entropy.
And one more thing. So you said that the revolution doesn't have a soundtrack. which
Right.
I love that quote. You could argue it sort of needs one, right? We need a soundtrack for what's going on right now. It feels like for those of us that are in it, as big as the kinds of things. But the last time we really had a soundtrack in our culture, do you have? This is probably not a fair question to ask anyone, but it feels like it ought to be way different, right?
Right.
There's something very new and different.
Right.
Do you think that just? I don't even know what I'm going to ask, but like, where does that come from? Where does it?
That's a good
how do you
question.
spark it?
Well, a lot of like what I initially wrote into this was like how in music it's using us to create new synthesizers and new drum machines and new software and then again new hardware and new things. And typically it's the technological innovation that happens that sparks a new genre, like drum machines or synthesizers, or electric guitars. Electrifying guitars was like a huge shift in genre, and that was the sound of rock, for that generation. And before that, it was access to cheap acoustic guitars that became like the folk revolution. And before that, it was like hand drums, and you can go back in time. So potentially, there will be things that will spark a new genre. I think one of the last genres to operate almost independently was like dubstep. Before dubstep became what it is now, it was a very small community of people who were changing the beat relationship of two-step, and then a whole new genre formed out of it. They pressed a bunch of records and put it out through their record shop locally. So it's a really interesting last sort of musical component to what a genre evolution looks like.
Okay, so first, thank you for bringing up the emotional tonality of blockchain spaces, because this is a very underexplored dimension. They are diverse aesthetic regimes, and software is fashion. But I would wonder, I think part of the promise of, you kind of shout on ICOs a bit, and part of the promise is that, the way that these, diverse aesthetic communities with different emotional forms of expression will be able to sustain themselves is through this, through magic internet money, right?
Sure.
So, yeah, how does this, homogenizing force versus the natural fractalization that happens when you have a new technology and aesthetic diversification happens, how does that play out?
So this is a really critical, important question right now for everyone producing media, because as media gets translated, everyone's like, oh, is it about music on the blockchain? I'm like, no. It's not about music on the blockchain. That's a different thing. That's a really simple thing. If you're a filmmaker and you make an amazing film, and it takes the time to make that film, you don't necessarily have the infrastructure to profit from that film. So the profit of these individual communities is really the question. It's how can they be not just valuable, but profitable? And it's unfortunate that we have to put them in that box anymore, but we do. It's all of a sudden we realize that we can't get out of the cage. We're in the cage. How do we deal with ourselves within this space and keep cool? Keep cool is really an important part of it, because if there's no money and you're hungry and yet you're producing value, you start to get disillusioned very quickly.
Right.
So I don't, and I guess my short answer is I don't think ICOs are the path to that, though I do think that they're a component of that. So I think there's value in creating an ICO, but I think we need to think more creatively about how we extract value from production or performance.
I guess one thing that comes to my mind is a financial method I've been seeing some artists do, where they have fan clubs, where you pay them, they'll do a Patreon type, just support the artist, don't buy the music, but support the artist, and then you get extra features, you can, I don't know, maybe hang out backstage or something, they come to your hometown or wherever you are. I guess, do you have any comments on that, so alternative financial strategies that they can follow outside ICOs?
I think that a classic example is that the Canadian government has been funding the arts really well and really successfully, and a lot of artists have come out of that funding. Even popular artists, I can't tell you for sure that it was Bieber or someone else, but
all those Canadian artists. Who was it?
Not the best.
No, right. No, but I was gonna say, like, Canadian artists are pretty successful, like Katy Perry and, yeah. So that would be a classical version of that. You know, I was having a conversation at lunch about how touring is not necessarily the best way for artists to make money, musicians to make money, specifically because what happens if you get sick or a family member gets sick, you have to stay home and take care of them. All of a sudden, you need a social safety net, and if that isn't in place, you're sort of screwed. And you can sell a certain number of t-shirts, but you will never sell enough t-shirts to make it work. And that's where we need to be really creative to create value. And it's not just for music, it's for all media, writers and filmmakers and everyone producing content right now because the transaction costs are so low of distribution.
I helped make a documentary about Professor Fingerstyle guitar like a few years ago, and one of the things that came up about that was this really interesting thing about proof of effort in these types of music where there's hundreds of hours potentially of a practice has gone into one song.
Sure.
I wonder whether aesthetically that's kind of like parallel to the blockchain, because that proof of effort.
Sure.
And there's something there about how music now, people are valuing just how hard that was.
Yeah.
And because we can have incredibly good computer-generated music, but do we really care about that when there isn't that human element? And strangely, the blockchain, which can be any less human, it has that aesthetic of, there's actually, someone burnt out a CPU building this string of numbers.
Amazing.
And it's kind of similar to, someone burnt out their soul making this 1.5 minutes of music.
There's an artist named Shannon Finnegan who does 8-hour paintings. And what they are is just her doing a repetitive task for 8 hours. And it'll be hash marks, and it ends up being very beautiful. But if you want to buy it from her, you pay her what you would make in 8 hours. So she's come up with an alternative metric for her time, and I think that that's a good example of like just breaking that thing open and being like, how do we value these things? Because that's what I'm seeing with the blockchain is like no one really knows how to value these things. There are speculators and there are people who are actually getting paid to program it, and that is value, but we don't know what that value becomes. So we don't know how to really create value now from it. And I think that's true for all technologies. If you were to release a Twitter song, it's only 148 characters, would it be disposable? More disposable than if you had composed it over the course of your lifetime? And what does that look like through distribution? So those are lenses that you can apply to any of those things.
What was the name of that painter?
Shannon Finnegan. It's pretty cool. Any other questions? Any other weird questions? Let's talk about weird stuff. Let's refactor something.
I don't know, it's a question kind of like a common thread someone has built off of it. Thinking of like music distribution and kind of the problems that come with sort of like a centralized music platform provider like Spotify, where it kind of converges onto something. I'm thinking of I went to this film showing that the director was present at. It was a remake of Prince's Purple Rain film done in some like village in Niger, I think, and he like worked like it was all like the people who lived in this village were all like the actors in the film. But anyway, afterwards in the Q&A, he brought up a really interesting point about how music was shared in the community and how everyone had this like phones, like dumb phones, but they had like really loud speakers. And so they'd play the music out loud, like just like when they're just like sitting around hanging outside, and someone would walk by and like, oh hey, I like that song. Like, what is it? And they're just like send it to them over Bluetooth, like directly peer to peer. And so I thought that sort of like peer to peer music sharing is really interesting, and I think it's it helps sort of like break out these like homogenous like factors and like converge you onto like one thing. It's like your friends with very different interests could like kind of pull you out of like your filter bubble and like force you kind of like introduce you to like this music they're interested in.
That's super important, and that's why I think that we need some way to incentivize the sharing. Because right now it's been punitive. It's if you share, you're infringing copyright. And I think we missed a huge opportunity initially to come up with a set of apps that encourage us to share music, because I think that that's what leads to like a holistic diversity. It's not just an atomized diversity. It's something where it all comes together and works together and innovates together. So yeah, did Prince know that they had done that? So that you filed a lawsuit?
I don't know how.
He hated people playing his music. He was hard about it. He was hard.
But the name of that remake film was Brain the Color Red with a little blue in it. Because in that native language, there's no word for purple.
That sounds awesome. That sounds awesome. I like, so piggybacking off like people in real space, like hearing and overhearing a song and then having that song. I wonder if you have anything to say of like if automation had a place here as far as recommendation engines. Like you said, it's hard to find a specific piece on SoundCloud, and I wonder if, I mean, as a music fan, someone who like preferred the days when people just had MP3s on their blog, and I could hop around on blog rolls and listen to new music. And I'm sad that that's not possible anymore. Everyone's on Spotify. Is there a place for automation there of like content discovery, or should we just kind of develop interfaces?
The analytics of sharing is not transparent right now. Like major labels have access to a program called Big Champagne, and they've been looking at downloads forever and ever and ever. So I think that, yeah, absolutely, like if it was not applied to advertising, if it was applied to discovery, I think you'd have a really good, I think there are a ton of ideas built into the need for better search to come out of the music sphere. So, and I would love to work on that. It's cool.
Could you list some properties of a song that would let it be sort of indexable and comparable?
Yeah, absolutely. Songs, I mean, key is the first one. But to be honest, I think that the best way to search for music right now is emotionally. And I think that the best searches are happening through music placement services. So like if you have a film and you need a piece of music for it, the way you search is generally through emotion. And so that's one metric that creates a lot of color in your search. And you know, all of the characteristics of a piece of music, in fact, are like, it's just pattern recognition. Like you can look at waveforms and serve waveforms. You can't infer more information than that. For the most part, you need to actually add it. But here's another part of like incentivization is that if someone feels that they have their own explanation for how this made them feel and they can interact with that thing, then they can tag it and someone else can find it that has had that similar emotion. Yeah. You know? Yeah. I think there's a lot of opportunity for search in music via emotion.
Does that, so you mentioned that searching by emotion for film scores and such.
Yeah.
Is that something that actually exists now?
Not well. It does exist, but mostly when I went in, yeah, it's mostly tags. It's mostly tags, and it's still a person going in and tagging these things. It's not, yeah, they haven't figured out how to port it over yet. Music's complicated because to convert an audio file into data is challenging. To infer a deeper level of data from that musical file. Like for example, you can look at a waveform, but it's really hard for a computer to say this was a guitar or this was a this. It can replay it and it can identify it, but it can't quite connect the two. And I think machine learning will probably change that.
Are those things currently like hand curated by experts, or they're just
They are. That's the best. It's the best way right now that search is happening. And like you were identifying exactly one of those needs. That's this space that I think the blockchain can have value, but with music cooling, there isn't as much like venture capitalism money going into music apps because there just isn't as much of a return because they don't know how to monetize it because it's a
yeah, so on this idea of music cooling, I haven't fully formulated my question yet.
Sure.
No, that's okay. That's okay. I think there's a lot to parse there. Like, part of your setup was that like previous revolutions had a soundtrack, but then you blame the cooling effect on the distribution technology. So, like in a way,
yeah.
I guess one. So that leads me to a couple places. Like, first of all, is it possible that there are lots of revolutions happening that we just don't have access to because, like, the distribution methods tend to, like, filter bubble us rather than provide diverse access, and or is it that like music music just isn't having a moment right now, and like the forefront of like cultural expression has shifted to some other medium.
I think that the internet has been a huge component of that cooling. I think it's very like optimistic to look at it and be like, oh, we're able to like send all of this music out to anywhere. But part of what made musical scenes volatile or have heat, I think, was the scarcity that like the community had, and that it was hard to access those communities. You needed to go to a record store and be recommended something. And generally, if you were recommended something by someone who knew you, you probably still had that record. So I think that, I don't know exactly why it's cooled, but it seems like it's just not a thing. And my best example is I hung out with some app developers from SF, they're friends of mine, and those dudes are the new rock stars. Like, they party like rock stars, their demeanor has become very much like a rock star. And the rock stars are kind of like quieting down, and they're like, I play music, I don't know, it works, it's cool, it's, you know, it's different.
Did you say we're the rock stars?
Yeah, no, just general developers, app developers. These guys did Lady Gaga's app, so there's a direct connection.
You won't weird. So everybody in this room keeps saying that they have a problem. They're not getting the good music, and they're being closed off from that. Isn't that a market need?
Absolutely.
And isn't that something that perhaps the blockchain could help with? And you could build something that it rewards people for making good recommendations. If someone does then go on to listen to that song, it becomes their favorite song, you get paid.
Yep. Yeah.
There you go. There's a business for someone to run off and make.
That's what this talk is all about. Exactly. It's just that that thing is not there. It's not in place. The mechanism isn't in place, and it should be, except we don't know how to monetize it. So like, there's no heat going into the engine. There's no fuel going into the engine right now.
Sure. On the flip side, any attempt to monetize community behavior faces the risk of undermining it.
Sure.
This is always a case of people trying to incentivize social good or incentivize some kind of like, that the original motivation is some kind of thing internal to a community where you...
Intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation.
Yeah, and as soon as you present that, you essentially undermine the fabric, potentially, of what makes that community work.
So then you would scale out to create motivation for larger communities.
But that's exactly what has happened already. Like, that is literally no different than the environment that we have now. This is not directed towards you, more at you, Alan, because like the environment that we have now is one in which like recommendation or like distribution of music is incentivized monetarily, and the result is that we have a genre of music called pop music that like one of my friends calls like heat-seeking missile. It's like just designed to like hit people who have no interest in music, because like people understand that the chord structure is popular is the one that maximizes like human emotional response.
Sure.
So
like, is that any better than like a blockchain-based recommendation system that's incentivized in that
So
way?
I think I've got right reply. There's the difference between the broad average moving and like the sort of that kind of stuff, and something that's targeted to an individual. I've got a friend who hates all the pop music stuff, and he hates the Spotify's Discover thing even, isn't really giving him the cool stuff. And every time I send something that's got like 10,000 plays, and he goes, this is amazing, I get a whole bunch of kudos, social kudos with him and others, that's something he really, really likes. And yeah, and then similarly I go into his playlists and steal everything because it's fantastic.
Isn't it sometimes the case? So it was kind of, so you mentioned how you missed the days when there were MP3s on people's white pages. You missed the days when you would go to a record store. Doesn't it seem like we all kind of fetishize the way that we discovered music when we first got into music?
Yeah.
And it also I mean, it also is the case that each new technology wave brings the new way that we discover music.
Right.
So when records came out, new technology, record stores, that became where you went for music. And then it became, then became MP3s on web pages. Now it's Spotify, Apple Music, and those things. Which I assume my 13-year-old son will someday be telling the people who are discovering the blockchain, this is crap. I remember back in the good old Apple Music days.
Similar things.
Yeah.
How much does that matter? Like you kind of alluded to the fact that the industry has discovered that particular patterns of music are very, very popular, and that's the thing that drives most people's emotions. Like, that globally seems like an optimal solution.
Wait, are you describing Facebook?
No. So, but then I assume probably safely, everyone in the room is in the early adopter part of the curve. Like, and I don't know how many people I don't know how many artists that cater to the early adopter portion are successful.
Well, I just did an experiment where I've got a pretty good history of releasing things to SoundCloud and then them getting a good number of likes, so it gets predictable. And I did a mix where I used all unknown artists, literally with either no SoundCloud or no Beatport or just no social media presence. And I sent this out. I have a list. You know, my PR process is to send it out to a good number of blogs, and I got 0 response with the list of these names that they had never seen before. And to set this up, there was a time in my life where learning about new music was the most important thing. And my metric for whether it was good or not was had I heard it or not. And that's a different metric that not everybody holds. And I think that's another case of diversity within the music sphere.
I mean, I think with a lot of the streaming companies, like the way that you maximize revenue for existing customers is for engagement,
right?
So that you can serve them more ads. So you're not going to play the same song over and over again, but you do want to play songs that beats that they're familiar with, so they keep listening.
Sure, and that gets into nostalgia, and to your point that we all fetishize that nostalgia.
Do these streaming services all have the exact same cost of distribution from song to song?
Honestly, I don't know.
Pay the same to Lady Gaga as they do some unknown artist.
I don't know what their contracts look like on the back end, but I think that there's leveraging that happens from mainstream.
Because I very much assume that my curated playlist includes only the songs that pay them the most.
Yeah, or from a specific catalog.
And you can tell it kind of, over the past year or so, that's shifted. It used to be more open, you could see more esoteric stuff. Now it's almost entirely mainstream stuff.
Right.
Just that they get paid more.
Yeah.
I'm someone who's basically like resisted streaming completely. I don't use any streaming music service. I never have. And I think music right now is like amazing.
It is.
It's so good stuff out there. And there's so many niches, like niche communities of people who are so enthusiastic about one particular thing, and especially in like the sort of private front side world, it's amazing. It's insane.
That's true.
Like better than I love the day when I used to go to a record store. Like I definitely enjoy that. I think it's a different thing. But I don't know, man. I feel like if you look, like what's going on now is
absolutely, and that's part of my criticism. Really, is it's a lie at search. Like search is really the problem. Like that's an obfuscated system that creates artificial scarcity, which creates your excitement about it, which is really cool. And like, and if I've never heard it before, I think that's cool. And so there's a continuum of responses that will happen.
I never heard your mix of like records that I've never heard of before, but I am the target audience for that mix.
I love it.
So yeah, the discovery mechanism is not.
So exactly. So there's just what would have been the blogs like back in the day when you just go through them. Now it's a personal server that you have to have access to.
There's this kind of. Oh, sorry.
I was going to say, I mean, I don't know if you addressed this earlier, but what about the sheer problem of volume?
That's just
so like if you think about like 1920s, whatever, I'm assuming there's like a fairly low volume going on, so you can feel movements much more clearly.
Exactly.
They say you have this extreme fragmentation, so find a little niche community that enjoys like tube and throat singing mixed with like beatboxing, whatever, which is awesome. But like, it's never going to be a movement because it's part of this fragmented fabric of.
So that's the noise that's happened in search with music, and then it's hard to tag music and to find that accurately within search. So one of the things that I think the blockchain would be really good at is unifying all of those what would have been tags into something that you can reference on a ledger. And I think that creates an interaction point that would be like a new tag system.
You're making me think that in the same way that like records leak, like someone actually just walks out of the master room with some MP3s, that like recommendation systems ought to leak. Like that someone should just walk out of Spotify and like just release it. Basically.
Yeah. Well, I think Radiohead has done that. I think there have been people who have opted out of
records,
who have just left. They've exited these streaming platforms.
Yeah, I feel like I've got this kind of paradox of choice with music now. Like on Spotify, there's gazillions of tracks that I could be listening to, whereas back when I was buying CDs, there was only There's probably only 50 CDs in the $5 bin that I could rat through and figure out one, and I would give it time when I bought it, whereas now on Spotify, I'll listen to something once and I'm like, I don't know if I like this or not, maybe I'll just jump on to the next thing. Whereas back in the day, I would have digested it more and experienced it more. So, yeah, but my experience is definitely shitter now than it was.
It's becoming, I think the best analogy is the utility, that you just turn the light switch on and off and determine how you sort of want to feel and what you don't want to thumbs down. Because the thumbs down is like enough of a metric that they don't want you to do that because you need more ads to be played to you. So you start thumbs downing things, I don't know how it works exactly, but that's where DJing was really important. DJing was one of those things that was really hot. I don't know if you guys were there, but in like 2006, it was really hot, and like people were making a lot of money curating, and it's just not like that. It is in Europe. Europe has a different, and this becomes about literacy, like how literate are you in a certain particular genre, is how comfortable you are and how familiar you become with it, and how it sounds good to you, and that just comes through repeated exposure. So like your friend who hates pop, if he were to listen to pop enough, he would probably start to like pop, I think.
I'm curious your thoughts on how like context or like artwork kind of gets bundled with the music itself, kind of aids the searching process. Like when you're looking through like records, you actually see like the album art. I think I've had something similar. Even just like scrolling through like Bandcamp pages, like I found like people in like similar-ish genres tend to have like similar sort of like visual aesthetics as well. So that's kind of like before I even press like play on the music, I can kind of like narrow my search selection down to like album artwork that looks sort of similar to other albums that I've liked. I guess you're talking about that.
I think that's an important part of the process. That I search for things by label. Usually record labels are the curators of consistently things that I'll like over and over. So I use labels as my filter for that. And generally the artwork will be consistent. I can identify one record, for example, from one label because they do the same thing over and over.
So it's like to your point, like the different art and even say an ad for a show, there's a certain tradition, depending on the type of music also, like a house show will look very different, both physically and textual, like the text on it, from like a punk show, right? Like a punk show description makes no sense.
Yeah.
Right? And it's like almost telling you not to come. I feel like that's punk tradition.
Yeah.
Right? And if you're reading it uninitiated, you're like, what the fuck is this? But in the same with house, like it doesn't make any sense.
So that's the literacy. That like, you know, if you get a stack of flyers on your car windshield, what party do you go to? Probably the one with some sort of abstract art and clean typography is what I would go to. That's it probably wouldn't be the flyer with like cut out letters, though at a time I would have chosen that. So I changed. I wanted a different identity, and as I grew out of that. It just changed. So I want control of that thing, and I think that one of the things that I really want to kind of close on is what it takes to listen to music, and that thing is empathy. And I think that listening as an act creates empathy, and I think that we can listen empathetically to our technologies. And so that, again, as we're producing blockchain technologies, that we're listening to how these things make us feel, or how they make the world in general feel, and that kind of value that feeds back into us. And so next time you're listening to a piece of music, you know, and you're thinking about feeling something, try to port that over to when you're building something and develop that literacy. I think that that's an important part of this.
Thank you, Noel. Thank you. So tonight, we're running a little bit later in the schedule, but we're all going to move back into the main room for closing remarks.
Yeah, you probably have to read.
One problem is yeah, like once you integrate that layer, there's
it's very much like in their language, power abstraction. Yeah, so I can read all that, or doing all that, but that's not my home. That's not my
and did you see that they like now they have like they've just gone and
This is last one for the day, so yeah, so he does his background in Earth and that's what speech like feedback systems. Right, so you're building, yeah, so you're building like okay, so this is like you have a system and you don't want it to explode, and so you provide negative feedback, so you're correcting to a certain value. And so when you're building those type of systems, it's like classic problems that advancements in art. You can build a feedback system so that you can balance the position and then it reacts and goes back and forth, right? So that's the kind of system that he's working with. So he worked for a while at Xerox and split off a consulting thing and started writing all this stuff on the side. One of his first things was so he took the office of the American and things like cloud business structure. It's divided into sociopaths can be and so then he used the TV shows to provide examples of like all those different groups and and then he did like a short series on different types of money metaphors, so like how you different amounts of money and how to think about it. Decisions. So like they just use a household transition here about money entirely. How money has changed. John Irwin was a he hired a phone, which was like yeah, exactly. It's like okay, cool. Yeah. So he did a lot of reading, and that's influenced a lot of his work and how he thinks about things. He's done like some executive consulting. If you executive consulting with his ideas, it just really accelerates things. Like
You want to like,
that would be like I started like the right read a couple posts and realized he started writing and started reading the Gervais principle. The Gervais principle, so it's Ricky Gervais, the British comedian who did the British version of the
All right, so you know how
it's pretty common.
like you can,
It's pretty common.
for example,
That's kind of how I got
like it creates an interpolation of certain like some sort of like
so he's talking about different cycles, right? So his example is like kitchen.
Like the upgrade that they did recently.
Do you have times where you just like wait something to cook and then it's on the couch a couple times or like chopping incessantly in order to get things timed correctly. And so it's just noticing the different
So it's a big
process that worked out.
So maybe try to say like what a tree is in English, like you can translate it to Korean. Maybe it didn't actually know Korean before, but it knew the Korean right. Like it did know like Japanese and Turkish, and like those are both in the same language as Korean. So it was able to from like the third. So from like the abstract concept, it could like spit out Korean tree. Like you can find the right thing, right? So at one point, what Spotify would do if it was chaotic good is like release like open-source algorithms so that people could see like the interpolation between like different genres and like create new abstract genres that like find like the middle ground between like punk rock and you know
yeah, think about it.
Yeah, now, like, that guy was saying, it seems like it's shifted over. Yeah, I really value not just here, but also
Taylor
oh, really? I have read that so many times, like, and just tried to ingest that writing style so that I can figure out how to do those tricks. Because, like, that is so
Thank you. I didn't know that.
No, actually.
Like, I realized that I forgot something. I don't remember because I totally forgot. He is like in the process, like we're doing it after the fact. I was like, it seems like it's a uncanny valley information, and I was like, gee, I'm trying to get more information. I was like, oh, it's about this thing. I haven't read it.
I actually really like that you didn't dumb it down.
Yeah, so like I want to know his career started.
Like, I think you're saying so,
like getting his perspective on
it's fairly straightforward stuff, but you've done it in a way that like actually requires me to think through the implications of like using that many layers of metaphor and mixing them positively. Like requires people to actually think through the implications of like those very simple proposals.
Not about 5 years. I think originally they tried to have it
different like value sets so that you can.
That lasted for like 2 or 3 years, I think.
And
about 2 years ago, they tried to do it in presentation style, and so it's all just
cool. I'm so glad.
And I think last year it didn't happen at all because of the things. So it's been like 2 years since people have met in person. Right now he lives in Seattle. That's about all I know.
Yeah.
It's weird when it's weird. So let's say like talking about I know. Like I realized that it's super weird information I know about people that I've never met.
maybe early on, and then tell everybody about it. When get money is because it
That's why I asked
So
you
just
guys
very
more,
curious.
yeah, we bonded last.
One is Discogs.
But
Essentially, Discogs is a community of people selling records. And there's a market that really intertwines with that. So like, they buy things, make sure that you can't get them, and then promote them through their social media to buy them on eBay. Those Yep. And the second thing is one of my very favorite stickiest websites I've heard of all the history of
Yeah, Taylor's traded emails a couple times, and I'm friends with Taylor on Facebook, and so like I'll leave comments and they post everything, but like, they have no idea who I am because they have hundreds of people around this. So it used to be just Simcast, and then we slowly started getting more authors and editors involved. So like Sarah Perry is somebody who, yeah, so I don't think so. I don't think she is anymore, but next to Finker, she probably works the most on it. I think about a year and a half ago, Taylor Pearson jumped on as one of the editors, and then also one of the contributors as well. And last year, they did a short course where they asked for writing submissions to panel, and if the idea was accepted, then they no, I didn't. So like, unfortunately, I don't write very often, so I didn't have anything to submit. I could be a job with so they know we're like iterative editing and everything. That's how they brought in a lot of the so it's kind of grown into a bunch of
Yeah. What's your? I'm sorry. I'm like, what's your favorite? I didn't know anything about it. Awesome. So that's like.
If you go to the blog, there's an about section, and I think he explains where the themes comes from. But it was originally a big part of his thought process is about eligibility, so things that are eligible versus legible. And
they were just like,
they likes to use for eligibility.
So I touched on
it was a form of like the way they subdivided the land in Detroit, where they divided it into areas.
Right.
And so because we farming on the river and everything, and so like I just want to take a picture of it.